From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. August 2, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Vince McMahon comments on Bret Hart, WWF Fully Loaded Review. By Dave Meltzer. While nobody in their right mind believed that they'd heard the last of Vince McMahon versus Bret Hart, McMahon went out of his way to goad Hart into responding with blistering comments on TSN's Off the Record talk show, which was taped on July 22 and aired on July 27. It was the first of 3 shows taped by the OTR crew on July 22 in Stamford, Connecticut, headed by host Michael Landsberg, who has drawn his largest ratings in show history interviewing wrestling personalities, in particular Steve Austin, McMahon and Hart. An interview with Vince and Linda McMahon was scheduled to air after press time on July 28, and an interview with Shane and Stephanie McMahon was scheduled to air on August 3. But even before broadcast, it was said the initial interview would prove to be the most newsworthy, where McMahon had agreed to answer any and all questions regarding his handling of the aftermath of the death of Owen Hart. Although Landsberg is, generally speaking, very pro-WWF and there has been talk at times of him potentially working there, he did anything but a puff-piece interview challenging McMahon on every topic and at times leaving him almost speechless, in particular when Landsberg talked about his own viewpoint of how Jesse Ventura had disgraced the office of governor by participating in SummerSlam and that when McMahon defended his current product mix by saying he's only giving the public what they want. Landsberg responded by saying pornographers hide behind that. There have to be guidelines and there has to be some responsibility. Still, as expected, it was Vince McMahon versus Bret Hart as the highlight, with McMahon attempting to divert the issue from the death of Owen Hart to a personal vendetta from Bret stemming from the Survivor Series. McMahon defended continuing with the Over the Edge show in Kansas City after Hart died by saying while it was one of the most difficult things to do to continue the show, that at the time nobody in the company even thought of not continuing. McMahon said he knew that answer wouldn't be taken well but that the truth is nobody even considered stopping the show. When asked if, with hindsight, he'd have made the same decision, McMahon didn't answer the question, but said that no disrespect was meant to anyone in continuing the show. Landsberg said that many people, including the family, considered it disrespectful and that he personally, if it was a member of his family that had died under those circumstances, would have considered it terribly disrespectful. When asked about not announcing to the live audience in Kansas City that Hart was dead, McMahon said his guts told him not to announce the death to the live audience. I don't know if it's fair for the people to have to hear the announcement. They'd find out for sure later. McMahon said he didn't know how the audience would have responded had they been told Hart was dead and said announcing it didn't seem fair, and said that announcing it after the show had concluded didn't seem right. Landsberg brought up McMahon's meeting with Bret Hart on May 30, which was the impetus for McMahon to lash out, almost savagely, at Hart. McMahon said he met with Hart out of respect for Owen, and said Bret carried the entire conversation and only mentioned Owen in one sentence out of an hour conversation, trying to indicate Bret really didn't care about Owen and trying to portray Bret using Owen's death for his own revenge. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, he said. I ruined his marriage, I ruined his career, all he wanted to do was talk about himself. It was like looking into the eyes of a skeleton. He wasn't human. It was a very weird experience. In fairness to McMahon, the meeting between the two, their first face-to-face meeting since Montreal, they had one short phone conversation about a month or two after Montreal where Vince threatened to sue Bret claiming Bret was interfering in Owen's contract with the WWF, was set up by Carl DeMarco, president of WWF Canada, who has been trying in vain to mend fences between the two sides both since Bret split with McMahon in 1997. DeMarco got his job heading WWF Canada largely through his connection with Bret after first working as Bret's personal manager, and later the family's problems in the aftermath of Owen's death, usually due to the clumsiness of his work as intermediary, which resulted in some of the post-funeral problems between Martha and the rest of the family with McMahon as well, resulting in a larger split each time. DeMarco approached Bret about a face-to-face meeting with McMahon when McMahon came to Calgary for the funeral, and Bret said specifically he couldn't speak at all about Owen on advice from lawyers, and didn't know why the two should meet in the first place. Whether DeMarco never told McMahon that Bret couldn't talk about Owen isn't clear, because if he didn't, McMahon's perplexed reactions to a lengthy conversation where Bret never talked about Owen isn't that outlandish, other than it being borderline tasteless to use that as personal damage control on television to circumvent the real issues of the death. If McMahon did know, that's a different issue. When Landsberg brought up McMahon and almost the entire crew going to Calgary for a much-publicized funeral, pointing out that nobody from the company went to Brian Pillman's funeral, McMahon's response was that it was an entirely different set of circumstances, saying that Owen's wife asked for the wrestlers to attend, which insinuates that Melanie Pillman didn't care as much about wrestlers attending, which certainly isn't the case, noting he went to Pillman's wake but not his funeral due to a conflict which he didn't elaborate on. He said, even though numerous members of the family were vocal in their disgust with how McMahon handled the situation after the death, that he attended the funeral both because he felt it his duty, because Martha asked him to be there, and because he wanted to be there. When it comes to the controversy about paying for the funeral, McMahon claimed Martha Hart wanted a very lavish funeral. Family sources indicate she wanted a small private funeral but did want the WWF who wanted to be there to attend, and he was willing to pay for it and send a deposit check to the funeral home and send a blank check to the funeral home. But that Martha paid for part of the funeral, which he suggested was on the advice of her lawyers. In McMahon's itemized breakdown of the $152,200 he spent, it didn't include paying for the funeral itself but did include many expenses having to do with items brought to the funeral, largely transportation and lodging for the people in his company, renting of limos and buses in Calgary for transportation to the funeral, flowers, buying clothes, sunglasses, hairstyling, etc. for the people in his company. He said he doesn't blame the Canadian public for seeing him as the bad guy in the situation, and said he doesn't want sympathy, but that in a conflict with Martha, no matter who was the one telling the truth, he was going to come across in a public dispute with the widow as the bad guy. He said the letter to the editor he sent to the Calgary Sun wasn't meant for publication. Think about the idea of Vince McMahon sending a letter to a newspaper to respond to a story without labeling it off the record or not for publication and thinking it wouldn't be published. Should be lying through her teeth, but I'm not going to win regardless of the facts, and again stated we were asked to pay for a lavish funeral. McMahon claimed the reason he's gotten so much bad PR is not because of Martha nor because of his own actions or the situation but because of Bret, not thinking for a second even to this point that it's mostly if not entirely because of his own decisions, blaming Bret for being in Martha's ear, claiming Bret has talked horribly about the WWF fans on television interviews and again brought up that in an entire hour of conversation he never brought up Owen. He claimed Bret took advantage of Martha being in a vulnerable emotional position and that all the actions taken by Martha and the rest of the family rested on Bret's shoulders, which is something anyone who has the slightest bit of knowledge of that family would know to be ridiculous. Bret Hart, who was aware of the basic gist of what was said but not quite the depth of how strong McMahon went after him, didn't watch the show but before it aired said that no matter what was said, he wasn't going to comment on it. It appears, by the portrayal of Bret, that McMahon was using his past differences with Bret to change the issue at hand to the now completely trivial and tired issue in comparison of the finish of the Survivor Series from the issues involved in a major lawsuit and his company's handling of the situation after the death, and perhaps Goldhart into a very public out-of-control response which would again focus the issue of Vince versus Bret rather than the real issue. While this is classic Titan tactics in situations like this, if you look at the company's history in past controversies, it's really sad, to the point of being sick, when they are used on a family member of someone deceased. When the conversation switched to Ventura, McMahon stated that both politics and entertainment sometimes make strange bedfellows. When Landsberg brought up himself being almost disgusted with Ventura for degrading the office of governor, who talked loudly about wrestlers needing a union, McMahon said that Ventura did believe in unionizing wrestlers at one time but said that since he realized all the revenue streams of income they make, he's changed his mind. Obviously a mind change that has been bought and paid for if it's true, because 6 weeks ago, he very vocally felt differently. He claimed the two had always had underlying heat and also underlying respect for one another. At this point Landsberg said that Ventura performing in pro wrestling was totally inappropriate and unjustifiable. McMahon tried to respond by saying if he was once a pianist and then went to perform after being elected nobody would say anything, and Landsberg said it's not the same thing, that by playing a role where people can't distinguish what is and isn't real about the role and using his position for marketing the show that they've totally compromised his integrity. McMahon was rendered almost speechless by how strongly Landsberg came across, weakly responding only that Landsberg has the right to his opinion, and ultimately Landsberg fed McMahon out of the uncomfortable position by offering that people publicly debating the issue only brings more attention to the show, which is good for McMahon. When asked if he'd at some point work with Hulk Hogan, McMahon said, "Never say never," and brought up that 6 months ago he couldn't conceive he'd be working with Ventura but is doing so now because it's good business. When asked if Eric Bischoff called him for a job if he'd take him, McMahon said that he didn't know what Bischoff could offer but that everything he does is for the betterment of his product for the fans, and that for the first time ever having a governor as part of a wrestling show is a coup. The show ended with a brief discussion regarding the change in product, and Lonsberg handing McMahon a softball by reading a quote Bischoff said on his show in early 1998 when WCW was winning in the ratings, asking what he'd like to say to Bischoff now, and McMahon responded that he doesn't want to say anything to Bischoff, and claimed his company went ahead because they offered a more contemporary product while WCW was offering the 1980s product. The lawsuit filed by Rena Mero against Titan Sports was officially settled out of court on July 22, with both sides agreeing as one of the terms to not to say anything further public about the subject, as well as discuss the terms of the settlement, which allowed both sides to save face in the aftermath. The WWF announced the settlement on its website and said they could say nothing further about the subject. However, before the settlement was finalized, Vince McMahon did go on Entertainment Tonight and insinuate that Mero wouldn't get any money in the settlement. A statement from Mero responded at the end of the piece indicated McMahon wasn't telling the truth, although she didn't get specific as to what wasn't true. They also had Paul White and Lisa Moretti on to knock Sable as a prima donna. What is known about the settlement is that the terms of the Meros' release from their WWF contracts are the same as the original offer from WWF. That Mark has a full release and can work with WCW immediately, while Rena can't work in wrestling until her contract expires in August 2001. In addition, whatever controversy there was over WWF not negotiating and getting a cut from the second Playboy shoot is now over, although whatever terms there were regarding settling that are sealed. The controversy over the name Sable was already settled in court on July 12 with a ruling that WWF owns the name. Mero was interviewed before the settlement on the subject of the lawsuit for the show Fox Files, which wound up airing on July 27. During the interview, Mark Mero at one point grabbed the tape from the cameraman because he was unhappy with the direction of the questions being asked. The scene was publicized before the show aired, and mentioned in the piece, which broke no new ground and was mainly Mero giving the same answers and making the same charges. The piece mentioned that since the filming of the interview the lawsuit had been settled. The most famous Rudo in the history of Lucha Libre, Cavernario Galindo, passed away on July 19 at his home in Xochimilco, in the Distrito Federal in Mexico at the age of 75. Galindo, described somewhat of a Mexican cross between the Sheik, because of being a pioneer of bloodbath matches, Dynamite Kid, for being a smaller lead heel who took a lot of risks, and the French Angel, for his unique ugly looks, gained fame not only in the ring, but as the lead heel in so many El Santo movies. He is generally regarded as one of the 5 biggest stars in the history of Lucha Libre, with El Santo, Mil Mascaras, El Solitario, and Blue Demon, and in 1989, was the first man elected when the Mexican National Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame was inaugurated. He's been known for some time as El Rudo del Siglo, the Rudo of the century, and was said to be, behind Santo, the second most influential wrestler in the golden age of Lucha Libre. Galindo was also among the inaugural listings in 1996 for the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. Although he had been suffering for some time from prostate cancer, his death was attributed to lung cancer. It was pointed out in press stories that he smoked an enormous quantity of Tiparillo cigarettes. Born Rodolfo Galindo Ramirez on September 23, 1923 near Torreon, Coahuila, he made his pro debut under the name Rudy Valentino in 1938 as a scrawny teenager. He was mainly a prelim wrestler until 1949, when due to his unique looks, he changed his ring name to Cavernario the Caveman Galindo and captured the Mexican National Light Heavyweight Championship from Tarzan Lopez on July 1, 1949 in Mexico City and held it for 17 months before losing it to Enrique Llanes. Despite his decades of fame, that is the only major championship we have records of him holding. He gained great fame in the 50s pioneering savage bloodbath grudge matches to the Mexican audience against his hated rival, Glory Guerrero, father of 4 wrestlers including Eddie, who had picked up the American technique of using razor to inflict blood from working the Amarillo wrestling territory headed by Doc Sarpolis, generally credited with inventing and or popularizing the technique of blading in the U.S. Guerrero and Galindo would proclaim in publicity interviews that they were starving themselves for days before their matches, getting so they become savage and almost cannibal-like for their matches against one another, which featured a heavy dose of biting bloody foreheads, and Galindo with his unique spot of rubbing jalapeno peppers into his foes' eyes. He was the lead heel, both as a wrestler and occasionally as a foreign creature such as a zombie, facing off in the movies against the likes of Santo, Blue Demon and Black Shadow when the campy Mexican Santo movies peaked in the 50s and 60s, making him a household name. In all, he starred in more than 20 movies. Besides Guerrero, his biggest ring rivals were Huracan Ramirez, Murciélago Velasquez, Emilio Charles Sr., Dick Angelo Sr. and Pedro Bolanos. Galindo, due to his small size, was said to have been a hard weight trainer, building a lithe but athletic physique for his time period. He was said to have been a small daredevil bump taker throughout his career, which ended as a full-timer in the mid-60s after suffering a broken vertebrae in his spine, the last of 17 major injuries suffered during his career, although he did on occasion wrestle comeback matches into the early 70s. His funeral took place the morning of July 20th. His death was covered huge in the Mexican sports scene, including a very bitter article in Ovaciones, the leading daily sports newspaper in the country, ripping into the current wrestlers and promoters on July 21st for so few attending his wake. The only wrestlers who came were Demon, Alfonso Ramirez, EMLO referee El Pompin, Mascaras, Juanito Diaz, and Aguila Dorado. An in-ring ceremony was held on July 20th at Arena Coliseo. In what was probably the best pro wrestling pay-per-view show in 3 months, it was the end of an era as Vince McMahon has to leave the company that his grandfather founded. Well, forgetting the stipulation no doubt to be worked into a clever return of McMahon, it was largely an entertaining show with better than average wrestling. The expected great production and strong storylines. The fully loaded show on July 25th sold out the Buffalo Marine Midland Arena with 16,605 fans, 15,194 paying $547,380 plus another $102,007 in merchandise, for a show with several headlines. Steve Austin won the first blood match over Undertaker, retaining the WWF title and forcing McMahon to leave the company until, well, they decide to bring him back. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, given the major push, finally gets to headline a pay-per-view event on his own, with a win over Rock in a strap match setting up Austin vs. Helmsley as the SummerSlam main event on August 22nd in Minneapolis. And underneath, the pay-per-view show, which had a clean finish, or at least clean by today's standards, in every match, opened with 4 consecutive title changes and was well booked with various angles building from the live heat show throughout the pay-per-view show, and culminating in the big finish of the card. As the saying goes, it's the winners who write the history, and pro wrestling is no different. You could do a book on the history of pro wrestling in New York State, which eventually grew into today's World Wrestling Federation. Toots Mondt, a former great wrestler in the 20s, would be the key man from the early 30s through most of the 50s. Jess McMahon, Vince's grandfather, was, as noted here many times, primarily the boxing matchmaker for Madison Square Garden when boxing was a much bigger arena attraction than it is today, and he dabbled a little in pro wrestling. Vince Sr. in the 50s became Mondt's partner, and in 1963, or about 50 plus years ago in WWF time, the two formed the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, WWF, after leaving the National Wrestling Alliance, and became a hot territory built around Bruno Sammartino, a huge regional draw. As Mondt grew older, Vince Sr. became the main power broker in Capital Sports, although he had several business partners which included Phil Zacco, Willie Gilzenberg of boxing fame, and Bob Gorilla Monsoon Marella. In 1979, the name was changed to World Wrestling Federation, and in 1982, Vince Jr. bought out the partners, largely through smoke and mirrors, his words not mine, and the successful make-or-break first WrestleMania show in 1985, and took the company nationally and even international on the back of the biggest draw of that era, Hulk Hogan. Val Venus, Sean Morley, pinned Joey Obbs, Jason Arndt, in 316 with a back suplex turned into a powerbomb, similar but not quite a doctor bomb. Rodney and Pete Gas were at ringside interfering until Test came out and basically killed Pete dead with a high kick. Test tried to break Obbs' ankle with a chair, although doing a similar such thing to Test didn't even result in as much as a limp, until the posse hit the ring with chairs. Godfather Charles Wright pinned Meat, Sean Stippich, in 206 with the dreaded pimp drop. The storyline with Meat is that apparently before the match, he got it on with Terry Runnels and was so exhausted he could barely stand up, and in that weakened condition, he had to go out there and wrestle. Didn't top athletes from Babe Ruth on down spend careers doing that and still dominate on the field? Not only that, but Runnels proclaimed that Meat wasn't very good at it either. Judging from this match, that wasn't the only thing he isn't very good at. All this backstory resulted in zero heat after the ring entrance, which contained enough silicone to make a midget tag team match. Triple H then did a shocking interview. At least that's what we'd been told for about a half hour. I'm still wondering about what was so shocking about it. I joke it was shocking that he did a good interview, but he's been doing really good interviews now for more than a year. Anyway, without exactly saying so, he cried about the 1996 King of the Ring tournament that he was supposed to win, but then because he and his friends, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Shawn Michaels, with Nash and Hall mentioned by name, did their curtain call at Madison Square Garden at a time when Nash and Triple H were heels and that Michaels and Nash had just finished a cage match against each other, doing what at the time was considered high crimes against the state for violating kayfabe, he was the only one punished. He blamed Jim Ross and management for holding him back and not having the guts to punish the other guys. Well, geez, Nash and Hall never worked another day in the company, so how were they to be punished? I guess they probably never punished Michaels because he was the top star, and it's not like pro wrestling doesn't have double standards when it comes to the top guy in the company. Anyway, if you remember history, Helmsley wasn't particularly over at the time. At his win erased as King of the Ring, they gave it to him the next year as sort of payback for taking it away from him the year before, and instead some bald-headed guy who at the time wasn't getting over a lick as the ringmaster came up with this new gimmick and was put over and did some anti-religious interview mocking Jake Roberts, and everyone knows what happened next. It cracks me up when pretty boy types who are given break after break because have a look but don't get over as big as people think they should because they don't connect with the fans as the top star and thus fail on top, and then complain because somehow because of their looks they believe it's their divine right to a top spot. Get given chance after chance, look up in your wrestling dictionary Fole, Larry, and Nash, Kevin, then complain about promoters screwing them out of their spot. Anyway, Triple H did do a star quality interview once you get past that. Later in the show, when Lawler brought up the interview to Ross, Ross proclaimed the idea that Triple H was punished in the first place was an untrue story created on the internet and the newsletters. Of course, in the WWF's own company magazine since, they've in their more enlightened behind-the-scenes New Age work storylines, also wrote up that same story. Next thing you know, Nash is going to cry on WCW about being held back the last 7 months by management. About this time, Undertaker came into the building with a walking fashion disaster called Paul Bearer in stripes. They did about a dozen-plus man-on-the-street interviews asking who would win Austin versus Undertaker, and all but one blitz moron sounded like reasonably intelligent teenagers and young adults. The only reason I'm noting this is because WCW tried to do the same thing on Nitro and they went weeks without getting even a coherent response to any question. Christian, Jay Resso, pin Viscera, Nelson Frazier Jr. in 243. This was really bad. Gangrel blew the red mist in Viscera's eyes and Christian schoolboyed him. They teased the idea that Christian was going to wind up back with Gangrel now that they're pushing Edge as a singles wrestler. During an interview, Undertaker attacked Austin, who bladed again, so Austin was damaged goods for the first blood match. 1. Jeff Jarrett pinned Edge, Adam Copeland, to end his one-day reign as Intercontinental Champion in 1322. Edge won the title as a surprise the night before in Toronto. Legit Ken Shamrock's flight arrived late, so Edge, who had worked the opener already, has put in as a sub, and they decided to have him beat Jarrett since he's from Orangevale, ONT near Toronto, to build him up for the local market, and then have him say since the match was signed with Shamrock as challenger that Jarrett is still the champ. At least that's what Edge went into the ring thinking, but somewhere in all that the idea was changed. They had Jack Lanza hit the ring and say Jarrett was still champ for the aforementioned reasons, only to have the ref overrule Lanza and declare Edge as champ for a day anyway. Deborah came out in a bikini. You're not going to find many women pushing 40 who look like that. Or pushing 25 for that matter. This was a good match but didn't have much heat until the very end, where Edge ran up a string of near falls. Gangrel came out and the lights went out, but when they came back on, there was no bloodbath and Gangrel was laid out on the floor. After several more near falls, by this point getting good heat, Edge hit the spear but Deborah distracted the ref. Deborah distracted Edge, teasing taking off her jacket. Jarrett knocked Edge into Deborah, who fell off the apron. While this was going on, Gangrel snapped Edge's neck on the top rope and Jarrett pinned him after a reverse Russian leg sweep. After the match, Austin hit the ring and gave Jarrett a stunner. 3 stars. 2. Farouk, Ron Simmons, and Bradshaw, John Layfield regained the WWF tag titles from Matt and Jeff Hardy, who teamed with Michael Hayes, Michael Zeitz, in a 2-on-3 match in 9:32. Hayes pretty well teased a heel turn in his pre-match interview. Match started and Bradshaw clotheslined almost all the hair off the crown of P.S. head. The Hardy Boys did great spots in this match and were tremendous, but Hayes and Acolytes dragged the match down a lot. Jeff did an awesome running flip dive out of the ring, followed by Matt doing a moonsault body block off the top rope to the floor. Matt did a pescado on Bradshaw, who caught him, but Jeff came through the ropes with a drop kick on Matt's back, knocking Bradshaw over. Jeff did a somersault senton on Farouk. Match didn't have much heat except for the Hardy's spectacular spots. At one point Jeff took almost a one-armed powerbomb while he was on the top rope backward to the mat from Bradshaw. Bradshaw then did a backwards superplex with Jeff while standing on the top rope. Jeff broke a cane on Bradshaw's head for a good near fall. Jeff then springboarded off Matt's back and was killed by a Bradshaw clothesline. The finish saw Hayes take a double-team powerbomb and get pinned, costing his team the tag titles. 2 stars. 3. D'Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, won the European title from Midian Dennis Knight, in 7-Eleven. The European title is basically a spoof on titles to begin with. Unfortunately, this wasn't a spoof on matches. Brown looked in the best shape of his career and came out strong, even doing a tope. But from that point the match degenerated. Mideon is one of those guys because he's big and kind of ugly that they think can be a good heel, but he just doesn't have anything. Match had no heat after the first minute until the boring chants started. Brown totally missed a tornado DDT and won with a frog splash. 1/4 of 1 star. 4. Big Boss Man Ray Traylor won the hardcore title from Al Snow, Alan Sarvin, in 10-13. For the most part, this was the same match they've been having on every pay-per-view. Bossman pounded on head with his nightstick and Snow was selling every blow. They went backstage and had one of those brawls that goes on way too long. Snow poured coffee on Bossman, who sold it big. There was a funny spot where Bossman took a first down marker, flipped it to 4th down, and punted Snow. Snow came back hitting Bossman with a plant shrubbery, not a fake fan, and Bossman sold. Next thing you know they'll be hitting each other with cotton candy and selling it. Bossman tried to run Snow down in a golf cart but the cart wouldn't start. They went outside the building with Bossman giving Snow a bulldog on pavement. As they were crossing the street they nearly got hit by a passing motorist. One of these shows they'll have Plant Keystone Cops arrest the guys for jaywalking in a hardcore match. Actually that spot was funny. Bossman broke a bottle on Snow's head and handcuffed him to a gate across the street from the building and starting nailing him with a nightstick. The ref counted Snow as pinned even though he was sitting upright. 1.25 stars. 5. Big Show Paul White pinned Kane Glenn Jacobs in 8-13. Bob Holly was a riot as special ref doing the Barney Fife to Show's Andy Griffith routine. What a dated reference, but it's the only one I could come up with. Show pressed Kane and threw him onto the floor for a crazy bump for a guy that size to take. Kane has dropped a ton of weight and it isn't like he was fat to begin with, and it isn't like the costume makes having abs a benefit to his look. He has gotten quicker and more agile with the weight loss. But that means nothing working with Show. Jacobs looks like he's in the 260 range or maybe even lighter than that. Jim Ross actually described their core match as being uglier than a bowling shoe and promised this one would be better. Unfortunately, it was barely better. For a guy who had potential to be a total phenom because of his size and athletic ability, Paul White has lost virtually all that athletic ability and his work gets worse by the month. Finish saw Kane hit a clothesline off the top and go for a choke slam, but Holly clipped Kane. Show used a choke slam and Holly fast countered him for the pin. It signaled another heel turn for White. X-Pac ran in and kicked Holly, but Undertaker came out and choke slammed X-Pac, and Taker and Show joined forces after the match to lay out Kane. Fans chanted for Austin, but they did the angle backstage instead. As Taker came through the curtain, Austin jumped him and he bladed, so both sides went into the main event as damaged goods. -1 star. 6. Ken Shamrock beat Steve Blackman in the Circle of Cars parking lot match in 4-19. Mostly it was breaking car windows and windshields. The undercard wrestlers sat on the hoods of the cars watching with the car lights accounting for the lighting. As a concept it didn't work because it was poorly lit, and it looked more like a bad movie than a real fight because the shots showed the cameraman right next to the participants, thus removing the dangerous aspect of the drama. The guys worked hard, took some bumps on the cars, although nothing compared to the insanity the WCW guys did on their pay-per-view for even less of a reward. The smart thing is it was kept short so it never dragged like the Snow match, since these type of matches inherently can't build. Blackman brought in a chain but Shamrock got it and punched him out with it and choked him out with the chain. After the Bossman Snow match, the last thing they needed on this show was another match held outside the arena. 1 star. 7. Road Dogg Brian James and X-Pac, Sean Waldman, beat Chyna, Johnny Lauer, and Mr. Ass, Monty Sop, in 11:44 to win the rights to the DX name. Chyna worked a lot, and while she's fine because the guys make her look decent, she only looks decent at best when working with her friends. Match was slow early and had surprisingly little heat until the end. It picked up toward the end but was just an ordinary match ending with Road Dogg pinning Mr. Ass with a pump handle slam. 2.25 stars. 8. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, pinned Rock, Dwayne Johnson, during the title shot in a strap match in 1921. Rock did yet another incredible interview before the match. This was a good match and Helmsley was noticeably more aggressive than usual, trying to get himself over as a real world title contender, but it was nothing special. The crowd was far more into Rock as a star than Triple H, and until the last 2 minutes this didn't have any special level of heat except when Rock would play to the crowd for a reaction, especially considering it was a match with so much importance. I'm not even sure why they had the straps because they barely played a part in the match other than each had the spots of whipping the other. Rock took a camera from a fan, shot a photo of Triple H and gave the camera back. They brawled in the crowd for a long time. Rock took some guardrail shots. China gave down. Triple H in his interview said he was going to win the match by himself. Rock hit the rock bottom but China distracted ref Mike Chioda. Triple H came back with a low blow and choked Rock with a strap. Rock came back by laying the strap down on his candy ass. This brought Mr. Ass down and he hit Rock with a club but Rock kicked out. Big pop for that. Rock came back with a low blow in the people's elbow but Gunn pulled Rock off Triple H. Rock gave Gunn the rock bottom, but this allowed Triple H to hit the pedigree on Rock for the pin. 3.25 stars. 9. Steve Austin Steve Williams retained the WWF title in a first blood match beating Undertaker, Mark Calloway, in 1531. Vince McMahon came out to do commentary. This was a really good brawl, in particular the work by Austin. Since it was first blood, they worked a style mainly of punching the head and trying to rip at cuts. Austin took really hard bumps over the guardrails both going out and coming back in. They smashed each other on the ring steps and Austin hit Undertaker's face with a fan. Earl Hebner took a bump. Undertaker was tied up in the ropes. Austin grabbed a chair but Shane McMahon did a run-in and took a hard chair shot to the head. Undertaker came back with a high kick and a low as in low, not leg kick. Undertaker undid the padding on a turnbuckle but before he could put Austin's head in it, Austin hit the stunner. Austin then punched Vince McMahon when he got up and tried to interfere. Undertaker hit Austin with a chair shot to the back. X-Pac then did a run-in and did a Van Daminator type of move kicking the chair into Undertaker's face and he opened himself up. Austin then hit Undertaker with a television camera. Undertaker had Austin up for a tombstone, as if Austin was going to take that move, when Hebner saw the cut and signaled for the bell. Austin gave Undertaker and McMahon stunners after the match until Helmsley ran in and he beat on Austin, who ripped the tape off his forehead and he did a world-class job of bleeding all over the place. Rock ran in. Austin and Undertaker continued to brawl. Undertaker at one point hit Shane McMahon as well. It was a real wild finish with Austin and Undertaker, both soaked in blood by this point, brawling to the back. Austin came back, went to shake Vince's head, and gave him another stunner as the show went off the air. Really good post-match brought the show to a strong finish. 3.75 stars. Coming on the heels of the fully loaded pay-per-view and paced by the most watched match head-to-head in the history of the Monday Night Wars, the July 26th Raw show nearly achieved its highest rating ever in a head-to-head position. The handicap match with Kane vs. Big Show and Undertaker pulled a record-setting 7.81 quarter-hour and 5,938,000 homes, breaking the opposed audience record set just last week with the Undertaker vs. Triple H match that did a 7.70. Raw drew a 7.77 quarter earlier in the show for the Austin final confrontation with McMahon. Those two monster quarters, combined with a 7.52 overrun, which included a little more than 1 minute unopposed, so it's really closer to a 7.2 head-to-head, for The Rock vs. China and Mr. Ass match paced Raw to a 7.11 overall rating, 6.91 first hour, 7.30 seconds hour, and an 11.6 share. The overall rating trailed only one unopposed show which did an 8.09, and the record opposed show on May 24th, a day after the Owen Hart death, which did a 7.14. Raw's record didn't hurt Nitro that much, as it did a number similar to what it had been doing, a 3.43 rating, 3.99 first hour, 2.91 seconds hour, 3.39 third hour, and a 5.7 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Raw's 7.10 destroyed Nitro's 3.16 by almost 4 full points. Nitro peaked for its main event of Hogan and Sting vs. Nash and Vicious, which drew a 4.08 final quarter, head-to-head with a 6.58 for the beginning of Rock's handicap match, and a 4.35 overrun against the rest of the Rock handicap match. The overall wrestling audience for the 5 minutes after 11 p.m. appears to be about an 11.5 rating and a 21 share, which is incredible for two shows on cable. Raw had no weak periods, doubling Nitro in every quarter except during the Nitro main event. At one point, when the McMahon-Austin confrontation went against Regal vs. Whipwreck on Nitro, Raw won the quarter by 5 full points, Nitro doing a 2.7. Nitro also did 2.7 ratings for Medusa vs. Patty Stone Grinder, Shane Douglas vs. Scott Putski, and a 2.6 for Evan Karagias vs. Ernest Miller. Nitro's strong quarters were 3.46 for Goldberg's return in the ring against Hennig, which was still doubled by Raw with Godfather and Venus versus Draws and Albert in a street fight, which is unbelievably embarrassing for WCW, and for David Flair versus Benoit, which did a 3.47, also more than doubled by a 7.28 for Triple H versus Shamrock. For the weekend, Live Wire did a 1.6, Superstars a 1.7, and Sunday Night Heat did a 4.10, while WCW Saturday Night did one of its worst ratings in its nearly 30-year history with a 1.4, actually losing audience from a 35-plus-year-old Andy Griffith Show episode that did a 1.6. I guess that means my comparing Bob Holly to Barney Fife is more topical than anything on WCW Saturday Night. WCW Thunder on July 22 did a 2.69 rating, which is the same low level it's been doing in its regular slot for weeks, before its ratings get knocked out of the box with the debut of SmackDown next month. Japanese television rundown. July 3, New Japan. 1. Keiji Muto and Satoshi Kojima beat Don Frye and Masahiro Chono in 15-13. This match was taped back on June 8 at Sumo Hall. Match picked up about 7 minutes in. Frye has really improved, as this was the first time he looked really good without having to be carried. Your typical real good tag match of this style with everyone playing their role, and a surprise finish which got a big pop as Frye punched Chono. Kojima then hit Chono with a diamond cutter and pinned him with a lariat. NWO Sting jumped Kojima after the match. 3 3/4 stars. 2. Shinya Hashimoto and Manabu Nakanishi beat Tatsumi Fujinami and Yuji Nagata when Hashimoto pinned Nagata after an implant DDT in 12-10, last 5:30 aired. Hashimoto and Nagata looked really good carrying this. 3 1/4 stars. 3. Muto and Kojima beat Chono and Michael Wallstreet in 11:06. Typical slow start picking up into a good match. Muto was dragon screwing everyone all over the place and finally got the figure 4 on Wallstreet. 3 stars. 4. Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto won the IWGP Tag titles from Kensuke Sasaki and Shiro Koshinaka in 12-12. Very hard hitting and fairly well placed. Goto, who is probably the worst regular worker in the New Japan stable simply because he's almost immobile from all his ring injuries, even bumped around a little. Goto and Ohara as the Freedom Dogs are almost equivalent to NWO Black and White as the guys who really can't work. But even the worst guys in New Japan can be carried to good matches, and Sasaki isn't even one of the better workers in the company. Built real good at the finish, in particular Sasaki looked better than usual. Goto hit his dangerous back suplex on Koshinaka for the pin out of almost nowhere. 3 1/4 stars. July 10, New Japan. 1. Koji Kanemoto retained the IWGP Junior title, beating Minoru Tanaka of Battlerts in 14:38. The two traded kicks, forearms and sleepers. Kanemoto dared Tanaka to kick him in the chest, which Tanaka did, and Kanemoto took the kicks. Tanaka dared Kanemoto to do the same. Tanaka took 2 kicks to the chest and Kanemoto then kicked him in the face. Tanaka used a pescado. Tanaka was getting one submission after another with rope breaks, and they were great moves into the submissions. Highlight was Kanemoto in position for a tiger suplex, but Tanaka turning it into a flying armbar. Kanemoto finally scored the pin after a big-time Shota and a moonsault. 4 stars. 2. Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa beat Jushin Liger and Dr. Wagner Jr. in 13:10. Only 4:30 aired. It was very good, but nothing you wouldn't expect. Otani pinned Liger after a Liger bomb. 3 1/2 stars. 3. Tatsumi Fujinami and Junji Hirata beat Takashi Iizuka and Koshinaka in 10:19. The last 4:15 aired with Fujinami using a dragon screw and figure 4 on Iizuka. Iizuka carried the match, as he's a really good worker who unfortunately lacks charisma. 1 1/2 stars. 4. Sasaki and Nakanishi beat Chono and Wallstreet in 10:02 when Nakanishi racked Wallstreet. Nakanishi did a spinning cobra clutch and his delayed belly-to-belly overhead suplex. A nothing match. 1 star. 5. Hashimoto and Meng and Tadao Yasuda and Nagata beat Muto and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Kojima and Scott Norton in 13:37 when Hashimoto pinned Tenzan after a brainbuster. Fast-paced match with really good heat as people tagged in and out and just did their spots. The Japanese kept the match going. Fans were into the power spots with Norton versus Meng a lot, but they smartly kept them brief and got them out of there. Meng in particular was really used well. Nagata looked the best of anyone. 3 stars. Mexico. Due to the death of Cavernario Galindo, there was very little press coverage of wrestling this week. The July 23rd Arena Mexico show had a rematch from last week with El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas and Mr. Niebla over Shocker and Pierroth Jr. and Ricky Santana in straight falls, with the second fall coming on a DQ when the IWRG Mr. Niebla, or as they say on television, Mr. Niebla from Naucalpan, interfered. Both falls of the main event were only 5:28, but they did 7 minutes on television alone of post-match brawling. On the TV show that aired this weekend in the U.S., they showed a scary scene from 2 weeks ago in Arena Mexico when Santo went for the same tope he's done a zillion times, and somehow his shoulder got caught in the ropes, and he went like an airplane going face down, but he wasn't injured. The semi saw Teen Nieblas Jr. and Brazo de Plata and Tarzan Boy over Cien Caras and Mascara Ano 2000 and Apollo Dantes via DQ. After the match, the Boricuas group, Pierroth Jr., Fuerza Guerrera, Gran Marquez Jr., Ricky Santana, and Villano Tercero, the only one of whom is actually of Puerto Rican ancestry being Santana, hit the ring to attack the Mexican heels, Dantes in particular. A masked man in black showed up with Kurgan to help Dantes out, and they are building a Mexican Mafia versus Boricuas feud. Marcus came out bald, so sometime over the past week he lost a hair match. There was a commission story that got some coverage this past week. On July 19th in Nuevo Laredo, they headlined with a three-way cage match with the loser losing his mask or hair with Tarzan Boy, Pierroth, and Zapatista. Zapatista lost, and was unmasked as Ishmael Reyes, who is past 50 years old and lost his mask for the first time as El Impacto in the early 60s to, of all people, Antonio Pena. Zapatista was then scheduled for a mask versus mask match with Super Parka on July 24th in Xochimilco, but the commission refused to allow it and it was changed to mask versus hair, and Reyes was most likely shaved bald. All Japan. Mitsuharu Misawa beat Toshiaki Kawada in 21:58 with his Tiger Driver 91 to retain the Triple Crown at the July 23 Budokan Hall main event before a legit sellout of 16,300 fans. The report we got is that the match was good, but disappointing to the fans who expected an all-time classic like most of their singles matches have been over the past decade, and this was nowhere close. Teihao Omori and Yoshihiro Takayama become the first Triple Crown Tag Team Champions in All Japan history, adding the PWF World Tag titles and the old NWA International Tag Team titles to their All-Asian Tag titles, beating Johnny Ace and Bart Gunn in 1730 when Omori pinned Gunn after his Axe Bomber, Funky Lariat. We were told this match was really bad, which you could imagine figuring a match with Takayama, Ace and Gunn against each other without any super worker to carry them. It was still considered a good show because of the undercard, as they had Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama over Vader and Gary Albright in 1329 when Kobashi pinned Albright after a lariat. It was pretty well made official that Stan Hansen won't be part of this year's tag team tournament, and they are going to break up his team with Vader, and it at this point looks as though Albright will become Vader's regular tag team partner. They had two other major matches on the show. Akira Taue pinned Pierre Ouellet with his Nanawa in 7:53. All Japan liked Ouellet, and it is believed he'll be offered a spot at the mid-card regular. In what was reported to us as a very good match, Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara beat Jinsei Shinzaki and Johnny Smith in 1904 when Ogawa pinned Smith after a back suplex. There was some surprise at Misawa going over because that would mean he would have beaten his top three opponents Vader, Kobashi and Kawada on successive shows and leave him without a title opponent. Misawa continues to be criticized for booking with Pops on the show that night in mind but no long-term thinking of building for future shows. Actually, long-term booking has become almost a dying art in this business anyway. Most, if not all the Japanese talent in the promotion just received raises, which was Misawa's payback for the talent being loyal to him in the behind-the-scenes struggle after the death of Baba. Apparently Misawa had gotten roughly two-thirds of the wrestlers to stand behind him in a threat to walk out and form a new group, and with all the wrestlers behind him, they'd most likely get the TV deal as well, if he wasn't put in power, although the power struggle in some form continues. Since the gates remained down but the wrestlers all got raises, the loser in this game appears to be Hansen, who was the highest paid wrestler in the company. Hansen had been working without a contract on a handshake deal that he'd have a lifetime deal dating back in late 1981 from Baba, but the unsigned lifetime contract is apparently behind phase down and out since Baba is no longer alive. Hansen wasn't even used in the Champion Carnival tournament this year, and even though it is months away, it was made clear he won't be in the tag title tournament this year either. The September 4th Budokan Hall show will be headlined by 5 fresh singles matches with Kawada vs. Vader as the main event, plus Misawa vs. Takayama, Kobashi vs. the Gladiator, Mike Awesome making his first full-time All Japan tour, Jun Akiyama vs. Omori, and Taue vs. Hiroshi Hazi, who works this tour on a break from the Senate. It is said, and I don't have the records in front of me, that with the exception of the Carnival and Tag Tourney finals, this would be the first Budokan show not to be headlined by a Triple Crown title match since June 9, 1995. Misawa legit suffered a broken finger in the Kawada match. At this point, the main event for the late October anniversary Budokan Hall show will be Misawa vs. Vader. Vader is now under contract with All Japan through 2004. With Bart Gunn having signed here as a regular and being released by the WWF, which owned the Bart Gunn name, he'll be starting the next tour with a new ring name of Mike Burton. Next tour opens August 21st at Korakuen Hall with Misawa and Ogawa and Kakihara vs. Omori and Takayama and Albright, Akiyama and Kobashi vs. Gladiator and Manukia Mossman, Taue and Kawada vs. Vader and George Hines and Hazi and Kentaro Shiga vs. Ace and Burton. August 22nd Korakuen Hall main event is Misawa and Ogawa and Kakihara and Masamichi Marufuji vs. Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga and Yoshinobu Kanemaru. August 25th in Hiroshima has Takayama and Omori defending the tag titles against Misawa and Ogawa plus Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga vs. Vader and Gladiator and 2 Cold Scorpio. August 28th in Kyoto has Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga vs. Kawada and Taue and Masao Inoue, Misawa and Ogawa and Kakihara vs. Vader and Albright and Scorpio and Omori and Takayama vs. Ace and Hines, which is a really weak lineup for a major city. Ditto August 29th at the 8,000-seat Chuo Gymnasium in Osaka, which won't draw well, with a Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga vs. Ace and Burton and Mossman main event plus Misawa and Kakihara vs. Vader and Albright, Shinzaki vs. Gladiator. August 30th at Hakata Star Lanes has Taue and Kawada and Inoue and Makoto Hashi vs. Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga and Kanemaru plus Hazi vs. Vader and Ogawa defending the PWF Junior title against Scorpio, who the last time I saw him didn't look like a junior heavyweight anymore. July 4th TV show did a 2.4 rating. July 11th did a 2.6 and July 18th also did a 2.6, so those numbers are way down for the recent tour. On July 18th, the show went head-to-head with All Japan Women on the Fuji Network, which did a 2.8 rating, which is also a lot lower than the recent Athena shows have been doing. New Japan. Some matches were announced for the August 28th Tokyo Jingu Stadium show, headlined by Great Muta vs. Great Nita in a no-rope barbed wire barricade mat electric double hell dynamite death match. The belief is the main event is going to be enough to sell out the 46,000-seat stadium that has only sold out once in its history for pro wrestling, December 5, 1993, for the first ever Takada vs. Vader match. Other matches announced are Shinya Hashimoto vs. Masahiro Chono, Scott Norton vs. Don Frye, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto defending the IWGP Tag titles against Manabu Nakanishi and Yuji Nagata, Koji Kanemoto defending the IWGP Junior title against Kendo Kashin, Tatsuhiro Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani defending the IWGP Junior Tag titles against Jushin Liger and El Samurai and Brian Johnson vs. Kazuyuki Fujita. No matches have been announced thus far for Genichiro Tenryu, Shiro Koshinaka, Tatsumi Fujinami, Kensuke Sasaki, Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Fujinami. Riki Choshu, Masa Saito and Nagashima all went to Memphis and Atlanta this week for meetings with WCW about attempting to get Bill Goldberg or another big name both for this show and also for the October 11th Tokyo Dome show. Seiji Sakaguchi instead went to Canada with rookie Kenzo Suzuki, who will train first under Joe Daigo in Calgary before the plan has it him being sent to the power plant to work with WCW. Fujinami and Choshu were scheduled to go to the power plant on July 27th and July 28th to scout new wrestlers for the Japanese market. Even though this trip would appear on the surface to look like the WCW/New Japan deal is still strong, feelers are still being sent out in different directions as to alternative plans if the deal falls through when this contract expires. Among other items of business on this trip are meetings in Los Angeles with Antonio Inoki, and also plans for New Japan to open up a small office in the Los Angeles area. Any ideas that is a prelude to New Japan actually running shows in the US are ridiculous for a number of reasons, although with the current popularity of wrestling on television in the US it surprises me that a smaller cable station hasn't made a bid for putting on the New Japan television show in the US to draw what would be a fringe TV audience but would probably do better than most cable channels draw, since foreign soccer, Australian rules football etc. are all over sports channels and wrestling would be a much bigger draw. I thought the same way in the 80s and it never came close to materializing then either. The holdup in the past was it was an agreement with WCW as a sister company not to promote their TV in the WCW marketplace, and also it's easier to work with foreign talent to get them to put over Japanese clean without gimmicked finishes when their losses on TV don't air in the US. They are doing an angle where Onita invited Keiji Muto to attend his own show on August 22nd to see what an explosive barbed wire match is all about since Muto has never done one. New Japan's final show on July 21st at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center drew a sellout 6,500 fans, for what was also, like the previous night, largely a one-match draw billed as the Team 2000 opening party in Sapporo. They were playing Chono and Onita's music over the loudspeakers, which supposedly got President Fujinami upset. They are building up a Fujinami versus Chono feud, probably revolving around the presidency, taken from the US, which may explain why Sakaguchi was removed symbolically. Hashimoto and Sasaki at one point attempted to keep Onita from entering the building, but Choshu told them it was okay. The main event was Onita and Chono and Akira versus Muto and Hiro Saito and Tenzan, obviously with the focus being on Muto versus Onita. They teased it for most of the match until both tagged in. Muto Dragon screwed him and put on the figure 4, when Onita blew Muto's green mist in his eyes and clocked him with a chair. Onita then blew the green mist in Tenzan's eyes as well, leaving Akira to splash Saito for the pin in 13:41. The mist was the angle for Muto to turn into Muta for the stadium match. Also, Ohara and Goto retained the tag titles, beating Kengo Kimura and Koshinaka in 10:31 when Goto pinned Kimura after 2 backdrops and a lariat. Goto and Ohara came to the ring doing the Sandman Beer Can ring entrance gimmick. Also on the show they had a 10-man junior heavyweight battle royal won by Kashin, further building up his title shot. Debuting in the battle royal were Wataru Inoue, 25, and Katsuyori Shibata, 19. Shibata is a second-generation wrestler, the son of recently retired New Japan ref Katsuhisa Shibata. Inoue is originally a protege of Animal Hamaguchi. July 10th TV show did a 1.5 rating, and I believe the July 17th TV show was preempted. Other Japan notes. Naoya Ogawa pulled out of the rings match with Yoshihisa Yamamoto on August 18th at Yokohama Bunka Gym, citing an injured shoulder and broken fingers suffered in the fairly amazing match he had with Gary Goodridge on July 4th. The match will now take place on December 22nd in Osaka. Rings will now headline with Kiyoshi Tamura vs. Yope Castell, which is a match that has virtually no drawing power, whereas the other match would have been almost a sure sellout. Rings is having even more power drawing than we figured since the retirement of Akira Maeda, after doing a $2.5 million house earlier this year for the Maeda-Alexandre Karelin match. As great as Tamura and Kosaka are, both as workers and for that matter how much they've established themselves against real competition as great real fighters, they aren't draws, whereas Maeda, who in recent years was neither, always was. It's a sad fact of reality which explains why certain people have to be kept strong in worked matches to keep shooting sports alive in Japan that purists don't seem to understand. Ogawa missing the September 12th Pride show also dooms it, since Yokohama Arena needs a super lineup to draw in a shoot, and at this point the ads only list Mark Kerr and Ensign Inoue on the show. If they were to meet each other, and the promotion has been trying to put that match together all year but each has gotten hurt before it could happen, it would be an interesting match, but unlike Ogawa and Takada, Inoue doesn't have the name among wrestling fans, so it has limited gate appeal. The July 18th Athena television show aired edited highlights of the July 10th and July 11th tapings from the outdoor Fuji Network studios in Tokyo with all the title changes and interpromotional matches. In one sense it was a disaster because of the torrential downpour which totally ruined several of the biggest matches, including the WWWA title change. In another sense it was amazing seeing the crowd of 1,850 both nights, in particular the second night covered in rain gear, still staying for the outdoor show while being drenched in the matches, even though outdoors, which is often a killer for a wrestling show because the heat dissipates, getting great heat most of the way. The highlight was the WWWA tag title change with Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda winning the belt from the Zaps. Zap T was unmasked in the second fall and wrestled as Tomoko Watanabe from that point, in what could be described as the best hardcore style match thus far in 1999. Some of the double foot stomps by Zap are scary because she'll come off the top rope to the floor, and once climbed high on the light stands to do one on Shimoda. The other highlights were AJW's Momoe Nakanishi winning the WWWA Super Light title from Shaparita Asari in a battle of two women who are like 4'10", so it was very close to watching a Mexican minis match. They were doing all sorts of flying moves, which was doubly scary since they were doing so in the rain. The fans were all hiding in raincoats, yet the match had really good heat. A later match with Manami Toyota vs Nakanishi was at this point under a total downpour. Perhaps the two best active workers in women's wrestling, still some talking and comedy, but still did dangerous spots, including a crossbody by Toyota high off the light stand way down, which was equivalent to an ECW balcony dive, the only difference being Toyota was being caught by a 100-pound girl instead of two or more huge men. Yumiko Hata vs Takako Inoue was mainly garbage, with Inoue chasing Hata around with her stun gun in the ring being almost unplayable. A six-man with Mita and Shimoda and Lioness Asuka vs Toyota and Kaoru Ito and Watanabe with the rain almost ridiculous at this point, the ring being puddles and the women looking like they were doing a movie fight in a hurricane, still had a lot of big spots. Finally, the main event of the second night with Kyoko Inoue winning the WWA title from Hata was a total disaster. The ring was totally unable to do anything in and they were slipping everywhere. Kyoko looks to be about 210 pounds with her spandex uniform getting the toughest test of all. I'd say it had to be, and it wasn't their fault in the least, the worst WWA title match in history. Finish saw Takako use the stun gun on Hata to lead to Kyoko's win. Match still had heat, although I have no clue as to how. Before the rain, because of the hot crowd. These could have been killer tapings because they had almost Raw-like production values. Some of the production tricks actually beat the hell out of Raw, although the look was more similar to the old WCW Universal tapings with a nice set, but it looked more like a game show than a sports event. Urgent and Neo ladies combined to pack Korakuen Hall on July 25th for a sky-high tournament of small flying wrestlers won by Asari over Mary Apache from Mexico. After the match, Asari and Apache agreed to join forces and challenge to the twin stars of Urgent tag titles on the August 6th Tokyo Ota War Gym show. In a tag match on top, Mariko Yoshida, the current queen of Urgent, tapped out Asia Kong with an armbar to do a backward setup, since Kong is such a bigger star, of their title match on the same show. Add Black Warrior from Mexico to Dirt Bike Kid, Broken Foot, of England to the list of early casualties in the Michinoku Pro Masked Man World League Tournament. Minoru Tanaka is out of action with a broken nose, so he missed his rematch with Yuhi Sano for the FMW Junior title, which is now a Battle Arts title not even recognized anymore by FMW, on July 22nd in Kanazawa, so Fantastique replaced him and Sano kept the belt. Tanaka got the broken nose from a potato blow by Masao Orihara on July 20th in Tokyo. On the July 20th IWA show at Korakuen Hall, IWA owner Kishu Asano, 47, made his debut as a performer, managing Yoshie Yamashita and Shoji Nakamaki in the main event match against Mr. Pogo and Tarzan Goto. Asano used a saber sword, apparently presented as a gift by Tiger Jeet Singh, as his gimmick weapon. JWP and Neo ladies also joined forces to pack Korakuen Hall on July 21st with Kyoko Inoue beating JWP's champ Azumi Hyuga in the main event. After the match, JWP's Dynamite Kansai said she and Inoue would form an interpromotional tag team to give lessons to the younger wrestlers. They are being billed as the 180kg, just under 400-pound, tag team. The annual Pancrase Neo Blood tournament for the younger wrestlers will be an afternoon and evening tournament on August 1st. JD held a press conference this week to announce a title versus title main event for August 22nd at Kawasaki City Gym with Kyoko Inoue, WWA champ, versus Asuka, TWF champ, plus AWF champ Yuko Kosugi versus Megumi Yobushida and WWA Super Light champ Nakanishi versus Sumi Sakai. FMW's Hideki Hasaka is out of action with vertebrae damage. Here and there. Reno Riggins' main event championship wrestling debuted with a television taping on July 20th in Nashville before about 850 fans, of which approximately half were papered. They had a 4-camera shoot with production values including pyro, a ramp and big ring entrances that far exceeded that of the local Music City group, purportedly spending about $30,000 on the show. They taped 3 or 4 weeks worth of television, but at this point they appear not to have a local outlet, with Leigh Thatcher and Dutch Mantle doing the announcing. During the show, Riggins ran down Music City Wrestling, although much of the undercard consisted of wrestlers from that promotion. They also announced a return show in November. Apparently the wrestlers from Music City that worked will be allowed to work Music City as well, so it isn't that kind of a promotion war at this point where the talent is being asked to take sides. Among the talent appearing was Tatanka, who won the group's world title beating a huge Yokozuna, who apparently blew up fast and simply left the ring to get counted out for a flat finish of the show. Also appearing included Wolfie D, Tommy Rogers, Stephen Dunn, Samu and Fatu as the Samoan SWAT team, Brickhouse Brown, Terry Golden, Stan Lane, Stephen Dunn, and the Bushwhackers. No showing the event were Steve Kieran, Chris Condito, and Tammy Sitch. Added to the NWA 51st anniversary show on September 25th in Charlotte is Colorado Kid vs. Jerry Lawler for the NA title, a tag team tournament with the winning team facing the Brotherhood, Knuckles Nelson and Dukes Dalton. For the NWA belts later in the show, a Royal Rumble with the winner to face NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion Logan Kane in some sort of an NWA title match involving Naoya Ogawa. There has now been talk of either getting the title on Don Frye, who would defend it in Japan and the US and also create a reason for Japan to continue the Ogawa-Frye feud, which has been dormant this year after being a big program last year. The NBC Nightly News piece on wrestlers who moonlight as wrestlers working for small-time offices for no money is expected to air in late August in conjunction with Ventura's SummerSlam appearance. It was supposed to air this past week, but all the JFK Jr. coverage bumped it. The special was filmed based around the San Diego-based California Championship Wrestling Group. Ventura's autobiography was listed as the number 5 nonfiction bestseller in the New York Times listing from last week. New Dimension Wrestling booker Rick Link, 40, officially filed this past week for mayor of his hometown of Lexington, North Carolina. Link gained a measure of national publicity in a failed bid for mayor in 1998 when a wrestler running for office was considered a mainstream curiosity. Ed Brock, who wrestled as Blade for NWA Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, passed away a few weeks ago due to a suicide. We don't have any other details on this. Reports from the high-risk championship wrestling shows in Australia indicate that the Mexican contingent of Zorro and Antifaz del Norte and the Headhunters are both having the best matches and getting the best crowd reactions. July 24th in Memphis saw Bruce Pritchard appear on Power Pro TV to build to Kurt Angle's winning of the heavyweight title from J.R. Smooth. Pritchard came out and told Angle he's been looking good but needs to get more aggressive. Angle used a top rope belly-to-belly for the win and the crowd popped real big for the title switch, and up to this point they'd been fairly cold for Angle's 70s babyface persona. They are doing some sort of a mystery angle where an unknown person put a bounty out on Brandon Baxter. Randy Hale swore it wasn't him and Baxter said that it couldn't be Derek King because King doesn't have that kind of money. In Canada, Stampede Wrestling is continuing to run shows in Alberta. Their television is expected to be up and running in the fall. Tony Condello of Winnipeg is running shows from Saskatchewan into Ontario and Quebec, including many Indian reservation shows, finishing up in Manitoba. Emile Dupree opened up the Maritime provinces in early June and will run through early August using the Beast, Yvonne Cormier, Theo Burke, Theo Cormier, Cuban Assassin, the Calgary version, Angel Acevedo, and Bobby Bass as the top names. Said the first run of houses did well, but dwindled since there is no local television and they run cities weekly. But picked up when Burke, who is considered the biggest wrestling star in the history of that part of the country, returned. It's funny because I remember the Beast and Leo Burke as the top stars for Dupree in the Maritimes back in the early 70s, and I think Beast was even old then. Toronto indie wrestler Joe E. Legend is on top as the IC champion for the group. Also among the crew is Chi Chi Cruz and former AWA jobber Buddy Lane, with the big shows being held every Monday night at the Halifax NS Forum. NWA New England Junior champ Jeff Mangles just returned from a one-week tour with EMLL where he trained with the likes of Pantera, Negro Casas and Tsubasa. Another wrestler from that promotion, Joel Davis, was a guest on a recent Springer show. Michael Modest and Max Justice as La Migra will headline for Martin Moran's World Pro Wrestling, which does a lucha style, running July 31st in Santa Barbara and August 1st at the Anaheim Marketplace against Mexicans Blue Panther and Misterioso. Main event is Mil Mascaras and Santo and Cholo versus Scorpio Jr. and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Mr. Maldad. Terry Taylor, managed by Jim Cornette, works the August 7th Music City show in Nashville against NA champ Colorado Kid, who has to leave town for 1 year if he loses. Nicole Bass appears to face a mystery opponent chosen by Jackie Fargo. Former wrestling star Angelo Mosca was arrested on July 25th before being at an illegal gaming house. Independent Wrestling Federation on August 24th at Grand Slam USA in South Plainfield, New Jersey has Simon Diamond vs. Nova and Steve Corino vs. Twiggy Ramirez. Jerry Lynn, Christopher Daniels and Mikey Whipwreck all canceled a booking for the IWW on August 28th in Cardiff, England, which may result in the show being cancelled. Otto Wanz announced on July 17th that he won't be running any more shows in Austria, ending a tradition that started almost exactly 100 years ago when people like George Hockenschmidt first made wrestling popular in Europe. Not to mention increasing difficulty in booking top names since they were all signed up with big companies. Is now down to promoting just 10 shows this year, all in December in Bremen, Germany. Wanz is now concentrating on promoting more lucrative strongman competitions. A group called World Wrestling Association is talking about running Vienna, Austria and has a debut show on August 28. Peter William, who promoted CWA shows in Germany, is merging with the VDB promotion to save the CWA tradition of running in Austria. MMA. The Nevada State Athletic Commission hearing regarding UFC is expected to take place in mid-August. The commission sent 2 voting commissioners along with its chief of medical and chief inspector to the show in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. According to Mark Ratner, who heads the commission but doesn't have a voting role, he said they reported the show went well but they appeared noncommittal as far as their opinions, which are largely expected to ultimately spell either the demise of UFC or a rebirth of the sport in the US if approved. The first show in Las Vegas is expected to take place in December. K1 is now looking at early 2000 for its second US show, with the live show emanating from the Bellagio in Las Vegas. K1 ran its first show in 1998, which sold out a 4,300-seat building in Las Vegas at high ticket prices but didn't do well on pay-per-view, doing about an 0.1 buy rate, which is half of what ECW does, although that actually isn't that bad without any television building up the show. K1 was very disappointed with that figure as compared with what UFC has drawn. Maybe they shouldn't be disappointed as the only kickboxing pay-per-view in the US this year, headlined by Don Wilson, did literally a microscopic buy rate. They've since followed it up with nothing that I've seen except for a ton of magazine ads in martial arts mags which have proven in the past to have virtually no impact on drawing pay-per-view buy rates, including no American television deal, which would be the key in introducing a new sport to this country. I can't figure out why everyone wants to do pay-per-view first, then get television, when the only way to make it work. I know people can point to the original success of UFC as the exception, but it's the only exception, is to get the television in place and build a loyal audience to hype the show. Then when it's over, try to sell it on pay-per-view. In Japan, the July 18 K1 show headlined by Peter Aerts vs. Sam Greco drew an 11.1 rating in Tokyo, a 15.9 in Osaka, and an 11.8 in Nagoya. The Ernesto Hoost vs. Igor Vovchanchyn match saw Hoost just destroy Vovchanchyn with leg licks until he couldn't stand up anymore. Vovchanchyn, a former world-ranked kickboxer from the Ukraine, has been doing UFC-style matches for so long that his tendencies are all wrong. He kept going for takedowns when none are allowed and the match actually looked silly at times. As expected, he really wasn't competitive, which again underscores the question as to who is the toughest fighter depends more upon what rules they are fighting under. There has been talk of a Wanderlei Silva vs. Evan Tanner match as a semifinal to Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz for the September 24th UFC pay-per-view in Montreal. Speaking of Ortiz, add him to the list of UFC names trying out pro wrestling. Ortiz is scheduled to debut for Extreme Pro Wrestling at the promotion's debut show on July 31st in Van Nuys, California. It is said that Gary Goodridge got $90,000 for his Pride match with Naoya Ogawa, which is about 4 times more than he would be expected to get for a Pride match. ECW. More than anything that took place regarding wrestling this week, the biggest news regarded an incredibly tasteless interview by Joel Gertner that Paul Heyman had done as a publicity stunt on the weekend television. The interview was meant as bad taste comedy regarding the death of JFK Jr., starting out trying to knock the media for overplaying the story, but then degenerating into bad jokes about the size of JFK's cockpit, insinuations he went down because he was involved in a mid-air threesome with the 2 women on the plane, jokes about Ted Kennedy's drinking and his Chappaquiddick mishap of a generation ago and also of JFK Sr., ending by saying if JFK Jr. could talk right now, he'd say, glub glub glub, sounding like someone talking from underwater. The interview played in most markets but was edited off MSG cable. Although the interview was clearly Heyman's idea of trying to be Howard Stern and gain attention for his product, a short item did appear in TV Guide Online on July 27, and there may be some mainstream pub as the week goes on. The company publicly did the WWF approach of then blaming it on Gertner and apologizing when the heat came down. On its website, in place of where the interview was to be transcribed, came a statement saying that ECW management refused to post the transcript, and that we here at ECWrestling.com apologize to anyone who was offended by Joel's tasteless remarks on the TV show. The only difference between this and Craig Kilborn's remarks about Owen Hart is that Kilborn told one joke which wasn't funny, while this went on for 5 minutes without being funny. While I don't know this to be the case, it was said to me by people who monitor this kind of stuff that it was a similar group of wrestling fans who were furious about Kilborn's joke and radio stations making fun of Hart's deaths, as also being the most vociferous and defending Heyman for this. I wasn't offended, because I know the game that was being played and it was just someone trying to call attention to themselves rather than be callous, But Kilborn was also only trying to be funny and didn't know that Ross Hart happened to be watching the show the day after his brother's death and that wrestling fans temporarily traumatized by it would be so upset by the joke, and the various radio hosts who laughed about it and played free falling the next morning were doing it also for the same reason of just trying to call attention to themselves. But this also wasn't funny, and WWF and/or WCW would be crucified unmercifully if they tried anything close to this. Heyman admitted scripting this as a publicity stunt to get the ECW name out before TNN starts looking for publicity, and said he recognized it as inappropriate, offensive and distasteful but not unethical, saying it was meant for Gertner to get heel heat, which is hard to get these days. He defended it by saying the show doesn't air in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, so he doesn't think any members of the family would have seen it. They sold 2,400 tickets the first day they were put on sale for the September 19th pay-per-view show in Villa Park, Illinois. It's now official that Viewers' Choice Canada will start carrying ECW with this show. Nothing is officially booked for the show. There wasn't much in the way of major happenings on the 4 shows in Louisiana this past weekend, with July 22nd in Houma, Louisiana drawing about 1,100, July 23rd in West Wego, New Orleans, doing 2,011 for a TV taping, July 24th in Alexandria drawing less than 400, and July 25th in Baton Rouge doing about 1,100. Rob Van Dam missed the shows to be with his wife, as she's still hospitalized in Orlando and needs help just doing simple movements, so Sabu worked on top against either Just Incredible or One Man Gang, who lives in the area, and did bloodbath matches with Sabu. Van Dam will only work the ECW Arena show on July 31st this weekend. In the Taz Tajiri matches, they added a spot where Taz breaks the Japanese flag over his knee. Chris Condito, Tammy Sitch and Axel Rotten all have sent letters on the internet regarding their future and basically admitting to past personal problems and claiming to be clean. Rotten was begging for his job back publicly, saying his grandmother's death overwhelmed him, and thanked Heyman for alerting him to his problems, which he's since cleaned up. Condito and Sitch claim they are coming back to ECW and have their problems under control. They may be clean, but the problem was that, judging from the letter they sent out, it appeared their computer had some major personal problems. My feeling is that it's far better to handle business and getting a job by going to the person running the company than trying to work the marks to get people gossiping about you and make the boss think people want you back. Although maybe in this business, due to the strange nature of it, it is unique in that way. The world is constantly changing, and WWF's rehiring of Blue Meanie and putting Jim Ross back as lead commentator, both due to internet respondents to those issues, when they had already started the angle to turn him into a comedy figure gone postal. And boy, was that idea of removing as the voice of Raw ever dumb in hindsight. Change the way people in the business operate. According to Heyman, at this point Condito and Sitch aren't in, and they haven't enrolled in college yet, and Heyman won't take them until they prove to him they're enrolled and attending classes to show they are trying to do something with their life. At some point over the weekend, Condito was even saying Sitch was pregnant, which may or may not be true, but the credibility is tough, since at one point Sitch claimed that in the WWF after missing appearances and later claimed to have miscarried, but when asked for proof from the WWF such as hospital records, could provide none, which was at least part of the reason she ended up being let go. Heyman said he expects to talk with Rotten this week, and if Rotten has a clear head and is ready to work, he'd bring him back. The woman without a name that Danny During asked to marry on the pay-per-view wrestles for Music City and in the Carolinas as Angelica. She was trained by the Hardy Boys and apparently is a good wrestler. Apparently her deal is she makes $100 a shot but has to provide for her own trans to get to the shows and pay the typical road expenses. Among the wrestlers Heyman is interested in using are Johnny Smith, who is a really good worker. He's looking at linking him with Credible and Storm and to use as a new opponent for Van Dam. He has a deal proposed for Mike Awesome, who has to choose between All Japan and ECW as he has full-time offers from both. Vader has also expressed interest in coming in, but I believe it's going to be a difficult deal because Vader can't do jobs and his primary job is All Japan, and the only reason Heyman would want to use him is to have him ultimately at least put one of his regulars over. There is some talk at the ECW arena to starting to further the Credible and Storm versus Dudley's program that would eventually be over the tag titles. WCW. Hulk Hogan apparently suffered a knee injury in the first spot during the main event tag match at Nitro when Sid did a botched reverse atomic drop spot on him. He was limping badly and pretty well immobile the rest of the match, and all we heard is he went to the doctors the next day, but haven't heard a further update. David Finlay suffered a broken leg and severed tendons in the leg on July 25 in Jackson, Mississippi, when a table he went through sliced through part of the leg to the point the actual bone was visible through the skin. He was bleeding like crazy from the leg in the ring. He underwent surgery and it was talked about as a possible career-ending injury. The initial prognosis was that if he could return, It probably wouldn't be for another year and he may wind up with a rod in his foot, or at worst, a clubbed foot. Conan was arrested and jailed on July 20th after coming off the plane from Nitro at the San Diego airport on felony charges of threats with intent to terrorize and injury to a spouse for an incident that apparently happened while in flight, and was released on bond at 8:10 a.m. the next day. Conan had suffered a neck injury and a concussion at Nitro the day before in Rockford, Illinois, when the ICP leg drop off the top rope ended with Conan being too close to the turnbuckle and the guy landing with his butt right on Conan's head, straining his neck. He's supposed to be out a few weeks but was brought to Nitro this week and not used at all. As far as wrestling, it's questionable he'll be back for his proposed match with Vampiro at the pay-per-view. Is now scheduled on Road Wild. It'll be a Savage vs. Rodman singles match and a Miss Madness vs. Medusa singles match. Everything else, as best we can tell, is the same as it was last week. Nitro's decent show streak ended at 2. The July 26th show in Memphis drew 7,201 fans, paying $128,675. Because of the new set, they cut more seats out of buildings, which is the reason the Nitro attendance and grosses even for sellout events are down from the same buildings in the past. On the Scott Hudson front, the 2-week experiment is said that it will last at least one more week. The show opened with Hogan doing a tired, outdated interview, although the fans were really hot for the first 45 minutes of the show. Nash came out with Sid and Rick Steiner. There was no acknowledgement or attempt to explain why Sid is now with Nash and not with Savage. They did a 3-on-1 until Sting saved the day. Hogan asked Sting to be his partner, but Sting walked away. On Thunder, when Nash issued the challenge, it was for Nash and a mystery partner who he'd been friends with for 9 years and was having drinks with him at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona, against Hogan and Sting. It turned out to be Sid, who, in the typical paying attention to storyline, was in Million in the very next match, while Nash claimed his partner, who they wanted people to think was going to be Scott Hall, was sitting there with him. And they wonder why people complain about their writing. Now Hogan doesn't have a partner. I guess judging from the rating, they figure nobody saw Thunder anyway. Reminds me of a conversation I had just last week when pointing out to someone in WCW about something on the last pay-per-view that made no sense in the storyline, and the response was, with our buy rates, nobody sees the PPVs anyway. I guess maybe they haven't figured out yet that is part of the reason nobody sees the PPVs. They had a dark match where a slimmed-down John Tenta beat Lash LaRue. Duncombe Jr. and Kendall Windham beat Psicosis and Juventud Guerrera in 5:24 when they did a double-team bulldog on Psicosis, and Kendall pinned him. What are they thinking when they book Kendall Windham in the same ring as Guerrera? Still, this was better than it should have been with real strong heat, except Windham was terrible. They announced Chad Brock would be performing on the August 9th Nitro. Chad Brock is a country singer of zero name value who had a top 10 song recently and once trained at the power plant and got a few tryout matches for WCW, then went back to country and had a hit. He's interested in getting back in wrestling now. It's scary to even think about how that quarter hour will do. Mysterio Jr. beat Vampiro via DQ in 4:52 when ICP interfered after Vamp pretty well killed Mysterio Jr. with a powerbomb off the middle ropes. Mysterio Jr. set Vamp up for a Hurricane Rana, but ICP held Vamp from going over. This was a really good match, and the only good match of the show. Eddie Guerrero made the save as they were all beating on Mysterio Jr., which I guess shows Conan is really in the doghouse. The crowd went unusually wild for Guerrero. This was originally scheduled as a cruiserweight title match with Ray versus Eddie. Stevie Ray beat Vincent in 3:58 after hitting him with a slapjack, and then hitting him with a slapjack, which are actually two entirely different things. Fans chanted for Harlem Heat. Horace Hogan was interfering a lot. Booker T came out and kept Bryan Adams from interfering. I guess he knew Horace was such a klutz it didn't matter if he interfered. Sting came out for an unusual segment with Hogan. The fans booed Hogan a lot after cheering him like crazy early in the show. He asked the fans if he should team with Hogan, and they booed heavily. Sting, listening to the advice of the fans, then agreed to team with Hogan. They booed even heavier. Then Jason Hervey came out. Before long it made me realize just how lucky all those folks were in the Mid-South Coliseum that got to watch Nitro without having to listen to him. Someday we'll write the ultimate wrestling dictionary. Annoying, V. Hervey, Jason. Former child 2-bit actor who goes on television and acts as if he's a Hollywood mogul and above everyone else. Everyone thought he was terrible in the booth except Bischoff, who thought he was great, and the initial reports were he'd be back there next week. Maybe when he's done they can find Steve McMichael and that little dog. Lash LaRue wrestled Prince Iaukea for 50 seconds before Savage hit the ring and destroyed both. Those 50 seconds were enough for 1.2 million television sets to click over. Medusa came out. Rodman came out. If all you did was watch Nitro, you think Rodman was this tall mute. Rodman kidnapped Gorgeous George. Like we haven't seen that angle in, 3 weeks. Savage went nuts. Evan Karagi's beat Miller in 3:32. Miller went for his magic red shoe, but instead opened his bag to find bunny slippers. Bagwell came out on the ramp with the red shoes and Karagi's schoolboy Miller. Miller killed him dead after the match. This was at least pretty creative. Regal beat Mikey Whipwreck in 7:55 with a Regal stretch. Regal is this awesome worker that desperately needs to get in shape to be taken seriously. I know that you can't judge a book by the cover, but nobody at home believes this pale, overweight, marshmallow-looking guy is really tough no matter how smooth he is in the ring. Fans didn't care. Jimmy Hart was on the screen with a hardcore trophy taunting Regal, who I guess takes Finlay's spot in the feud. David Taylor hit Whipwreck with the flagpole to set up the finish. Gene interviewed David Flair, who did a better interview than you'd think. He actually showed some promise and potential, but they may have killed him dead before he started, the same way Eric Watt's career never went anywhere. Or maybe it was just that Tori Wilson makes anything within 5 feet of her look major league. Savage, who had already gotten Gorgeous George back, so I guess Rodman isn't a 60-minute man, wanted to fight Rodman. He went to Rodman's trailer. Rodman acted like the commotion had just woke him up. Shane Douglas did an interview. He kept going on and on about how Benoit, Malenko and Saturn are guys you can trust. By the time it was over, I was sure he was turning on them. He then cut a promo on Flair and at least mentioned him by name this week. Goldberg beat Hennig via DQ in 2:14. Goldberg speared everyone and ref Mickey J signaled for the bell. Even though Hennig is getting a push, I can't believe Goldberg didn't get a clean pin his first match back. Medusa pinned Patty Stone Grinder, the former Leilani Kai, with a German suplex in 3:23. Douglas pinned Scott Putski with a Fisherman Buster in 3:41. Douglas tried to do Flair spots, and was doing them in slow motion. Douglas looked slow, banged up and out of shape. David Flair pinned Benoit in a U.S. title match when Benoit wiped the mat with David. Benoit twice had David beat with a Boston Crab and a crossface, with David submitting, but Charles Robinson refused to accept the submission. Okay, Rick is no longer president, so why is a biased ref like Charles still in the ring with Sting in charge? And why on earth is he refereeing David's match? I guess that makes Sting the most incompetent president of them all, because the rest of the idiots at least had ulterior motives. DDP hit Benoit with the title belt for the pin in 4:53, which set up a 3-on-3 with Benoit, Saturn and Malenko versus Triad. Douglas ran in late after the Triad took a powder. These things change on a daily basis, but an idea floated last week was for Douglas to screw Benoit and company at the end, and the new horsemen would be Douglas, Barry Windham, Hennig and Dustin Rhodes, managed by Flair. Arn Anderson is totally out of the picture, as he was supposed to debut in the ring for this feud on July 22nd in Moline, Illinois, and couldn't get doctor's clearance to wrestle. Bischoff then pulled him off television. Rick Steiner kept the TV title, beating Chase Tatum with the sky-high bulldog that missed in 2:26. Somebody ought to keep track of the percentage of times he does the move where it looks good. Finally, Nash and Sid beat Hogan and Sting in 9:33. Hogan got the knee injury early and Sting had to carry the match. This match had super heat, even though Sid was missing spots all over the place, to the point it made Nash look like a good worker. After a ref bump, Rick Steiner hit Sting with a chair. Steiner tripped Hogan, leading to a chair shot, and Nash pinned Hogan. Hogan bladed just before the chair shot, and since it was Hogan, the cameras didn't pan out and the blood was clearly visible. Hey, that's the game in 1999, and the blade is back as a strong part of it. Goldberg did a run-in, but the heels left him laying. The ending of the show was good for heat. Ref Brian Hildebrand, who has a benefit show July 30th in Rostraver, Pennsylvania. Hugh Morris was added to the show this weekend, and Billy Kidman is probably coming in to face Eddie Guerrero. Rolled his car about 2 weeks back, but for a guy who was due some good luck, he got it, as he came out without a scratch. Thunder on July 22nd in Moline, Illinois opened with somebody's idea of a bad practical joke, as Van Hammer beat Kaz Hayashi with a Cobra Clutch Slam in a bad-size comedy match in 5:34. Miss Madness pinned Brandy Alexander with a Northern Lights suplex in 6:54 in one of the strangest matches ever on Thunder. Miss Madness came out with a new outfit which shows off her implants, which automatically made her a face. This match wasn't good, although Miss Madness did a few cute moves. Alexander did an unbelievable job of drawing heat. I can't emphasize how impressive it was on WCW after a horrible opener and match that had no business getting over to see how much heat they got and how into Miss Madness as a face the fans were, even though everything she had done in WCW up to this point was as a heel. Under the three women, she had seemed to be the most nameless and faceless of the three. Hennig did an interview trying to turn himself back heel for the Goldberg match on Nitro. He then beat Tatum in 5:27 with the Fisherman Suplex. I don't know what they did for all those years in the power plant with Tatum because they sure didn't teach him to wrestle. He has no concept of how and when to sell. Finish was to make the Rednecks faces as the No Limit Soldiers screwed up, and Swole hit Tatum with a heart punch leading to Hennig's win. Tatum forgot to sell the heart punch, though. Mysterio Jr. and Eddie Guerrero beat Psicosis and Juvie in 8:26 when Ray pinned Psicosis with a Frankensteiner off the top thrown up there by Eddie. Excellent match with excellent heat. WCW has no excuse not to have matches this good on a regular basis except the same old politics we write about every week. Savage did an interview and fired Miss Madness. He told her to get on her knees and beg for the job. She got on her knees. He fired her anyway. She just walked off like a whipped puppy. This was another example of making sure someone didn't get over as if they wanted to turn her face, and judging from the crowd reaction they didn't need to turn her to begin with. She should have refused to get on her knees and stood up for herself before getting fired. But it was all about Savage getting over as the cool face/heel at the same time and keeping everyone else as the bit players. Only problem with this is even though in a sense it's better to have Gorgeous George as the only one with Savage, now who is going to work for the matches for him? Rick Steiner beat Sick Boy in 1:53 with the Bulldog. They did a vignette introducing a new character called Berlin, which will turn out to be Alex Wright. Nash did the interview by phone to set up the Nitro main event. It was among the worst interviews ever done by him. Sid beat Lenny Lane and Lodi in a handicap match, powerbombing both guys in 1:27. Main event saw Flair pin Malenko in 10:47 in what was supposed to be a tag match with Arn Wrestling. Arn wasn't allowed to go out because he was injured, but Ossia still went out with Flair. Jim Cornette used to complain about a business where Sable could get 7 figures and so much airtime and he couldn't get on television, but at least Sable had looks and was over. Now explain why Arn Anderson isn't allowed at ringside and Ossia is. It was amazing watching this show because you could have heard a pin drop when Sid wrestled and nobody cared about Flair, yet they went crazy for Brandy Alexander, Miss Madness and the Mexicans. Finish saw the Triad, Benoit and Malenko all get involved, and as usual, WCW makes their young baby faces look like impotent guys out of their league as DDP cost Malenko the match despite having his friends to watch his back. For the show to air on July 29th, Regal beat Smiley in 6:59 with the Regal stretch. Finlay was in Regal's corner, so it'll be interesting to see how that's explained in commentary. Miller pinned Barry Darsow in 4:04 with a kick with the magic shoe. BA and Swole beat Knobbs and Morris by DQ at 10:10 when Finlay, Regal and Taylor attacked Knobbs and Morris. Those poor announcers having to explain Finlay's miraculous recovery, or those poor editors having to make up for all the time spent on this show with Finlay out there. Bagwell beat Watts in 9:10 when Miller's interference backfired. Booker T beat Bigelow by DQ in 4:05 when DDP and Canyon interfered, with Stevie Ray making the save with 2 chairs. Ray tripped getting into the ring. The two brothers hugged, had their total reunion and screamed for a tag title shot at the pay-per-view. Main event was Flair and Canyon and Page over Benoit and Malenko and Saturn in 8:08 when Flair KO'd Benoit with a foreign object and Canyon pinned him. Too bad on Monday they had said that Flair was in Japan for a week on the Destroyers tour. Douglas ran in too late to save the day, claiming he couldn't get a flight out of Pittsburgh on time. Douglas got over by the end of his interview. It should be noted that while there were 6,754 fans at this show, it was almost half paper with 3,560 paid. Apparently last week Bischoff was shocked on Tuesday when the ratings came in, not so much at the overall number but seeing just how badly Hogan vs. got screamed by Undertaker vs. Triple H. On a radio show this past week, the host brought up that the Raw main event beat the Nitro main event by 4 ratings points. Hogan's response was that it was Malenko, Benoit, Saturn and Douglas that brought the rating down and he had to make up lost ground. For the record, the Rednecks vs. Benoit and Saturn with the run-ins by Malenko and Douglas drew a 3.3. The final quarter was the ring intros and beginning of Hogan vs. Sid, which did a 2.9, and the overrun was the continuation of that match, which did a 3.5, some of which went unopposed. WWF did a 6.4 rating against Benoit, Malenko, etc., and grew to the 7.0 quarter against Hogan and Sid and the 7.7 overrun against Hogan and Sid. Master P is officially gone. Conan and Mysterio Jr. have been pulled out of the No Limit Soldiers, which will now become a jobber group. There is some attempt to pull Brad Armstrong out of the Soldiers and group him with Mysterio Jr., Conan and Eddie Guerrero. The original plan was for Guerrero to quickly turn on Mysterio Jr., but since they were so hot together as a team in Milan, perhaps that won't happen as quickly. Sonny Wanu has wanted to bring in guys like Sumo Fuji, Shima Nobunaga, Judo Suwa and Magnum Tokyo doing a Japanese motorcycle gang gimmick to feud with some of the nameless, faceless Mexican contingent, but if they let those guys go they'll have great matches, we can lengthen the odds of that happening. Instead, Stevie Ray will have to do singles matches with all the members of the Black and White Building for the Ultimate Showdown against Ernest Miller. Ted DiBiase was speaking in Denver over the weekend at a church. DiBiase is said to be very charismatic in that role and publicly is very critical of what pro wrestling has turned into. He called WWF pure pornography and can't believe parents would let their children watch it. He said he feels sorry for anyone who has Steve Austin as their hero because he mocks a famous biblical passage. He said WCW treads on a thin line. He says even though he works for them, usually doing the backstage blast pay-per-view once per month, that he keeps seeing women in less and less clothes, and if it keeps going this way he may not be able to work for them anymore. Dean Roll, who does indies in Ohio and the area as Shark Boy, was something of a cult favorite of a lot of Major League Pro wrestlers, particularly in the WWF, signed a developmental deal with WCW, which is scouring the country trying to bring junior heavyweights into the power plant. As mentioned many times, the power plant training methods have come under more and more criticism because of how many new stars WWF has created as compared with WCW. Instead of working in the ring, it seems Buddy Lee Parker is like a boot camp instructor who gets guys into great condition but they don't learn in ring wrestling enough, so you see these Chase Tatum and Chip Minton looking characters who look like $1 million, and after years of training can't even do an acceptable TV squash match. Mysterio Jr. missed a few house shows this weekend due to a family situation and was replaced by Kaz Hayashi, who teamed with Chavo Jr. against Benoit and Malenko. Chris Jericho's final WCW match was July 21st in Peoria, Illinois in a tag match teaming with Eddie against Kidman and Mysterio Jr., forgetting of course that Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero on television are now a tag team. Nobody should complain because this was set to be 4 stars plus, going 24-37 and including every element of drama, building and a great climax. Before the match started, Jericho said that if he got pinned, he'd leave WCW. Mysterio Jr. then said everyone already knew this was his last night in WCW. As the match went on, they teased dissension with Jericho and Guerrero, ending with Guerrero frog splashing Jericho, who was pinned. Mysterio Jr. then tipped his hat to Jericho and all 4 hugged in the ring. There were fans near tears, as was Jericho. Kidman said over the mic that he'd miss Jericho and Mysterio Jr. started a Jericho chant. Jericho then said he was overwhelmed at the response he was getting, but he then said he still thinks Peoria sucks. Just wondering if people in WCW realize just how lame it sounds when Goldberg is referred to as the Phenom after everyone has heard that exact term used for Undertaker for so many years. Maybe they can call Ernest Miller the 8th wonder of the world next. Conan Bigelow, Saturn and the Steiners on July 27th were filming a TV commercial for the Kansas Lottery. Raven is expected back in the ring in about a month or 2. Scott Steiner is expected back around the same time. He's currently recuperating from surgery as well as from a ruptured disc in his back. Shows this week were WCW Saturday Night Taping July 20th in Madison, Wisconsin drew 1,655, 4,464 in the building, papered like crazy, for $33,117. July 21st in Peoria, Illinois drew 1,830, paying $43,695. Thunder July 22nd in Moline, Illinois drew 3,560, paying $112,588. July 23rd in Nashville drew 4,273, paying $88,433. July 24th in Little Rock, Arkansas drew 7,358, paying $144,024. July 25th in Jackson, Mississippi drew 6,234, paying $134,688. Peoria was headlined by Sting vs. Flair, 8 minutes main event, while Nashville, Little Rock and Jackson had Goldberg vs. DDP, although Sting Flair also worked Jackson. They were Goldberg's first matches back since the knee injury and holdout. WCW was really happy considering how things are going with the houses in Little Rock and Jackson. Merchandise for the week was $173,278 or $5.40 per head. House show for August 8th in Phoenix is Nash vs. Sid, making perfect sense coming out of current television. Sting vs. DDP, Conan and Mysterio Jr. vs. Wyndham and Hennig, Huck, who should be back in action in about a week after the neck injury suffered in the Junkyard Battle Royal, vs. Knobs, Eddie and Chavo vs. Benoit and Malenko, Disco vs. Miller, Saturn vs. Bigelow, Kidman vs. Canyon and Juventud and Silver King and Hector Garza vs. Psicosis and Parka and Blitzkrieg. August 20th in San Francisco, August 21st in Reno and August 22nd in Los Angeles at the Forum are all Hogan and Sting vs. Savage and Vicious, Goldberg vs. Flair, Conan and Mysterio Jr. vs. Hennigan Wyndham, Bagwell vs. Rick Steiner, Eddie and Chavo vs. Kendall Windham and Duncombe, a four-way with Hawk vs. Knobs vs. Barbarian vs. Meng, Juvie vs. Blitzkrieg and Miller vs. Chris Adams. Besides Hawk, both Cyclope and Silver King also haven't returned to action since the Junkyard Battle Royal. Miller was legitimately very upset at Bagwell for that promo where Bagwell acted like Miller, particularly feeling that Bagwell going out there in blackface made it come across as racist. Kimberly Falkenberg, called Kimberly Page, of the Nitro Girls, is in the current Playboy Hardbodies, mentioning her as a member of the Nitro Girls, and that she formerly managed Diamond Dallas Page in the World Wrestling Federation. The July 26 Hollywood Reporter had a short item about the WCW movie. David Arquette, Scream 3, stars in the movie. People who have read the script say it's awful, somewhat taken out of the Bret Hart deal, isn't everything. About two wrestling fans who find out ahead of time that the promoter is about to screw their favorite wrestler in a match and they try to warn him ahead of time. Rose McGowan plays a Nitro Girl in the comedy written by Stephen Brill, who wrote Mighty Ducks. Bischoff will be the executive producer and several WCW wrestlers will appear in the movie. The AP did a story on July 24th based out of the Little Rock House show warning parents about bringing kids to wrestling, like that'll do any good. They interviewed the director of the psychological clinic at the University of Arkansas, who said that a lot of kids can't discriminate between what's real and what's entertainment. It brought up the child in Dallas who was killed. Dr. Mark Hillett of Arkansas Children's Hospital noted that young children have larger heads, which makes serious jolts even more dangerous, and their necks are more easily injured. The story did note the key point, and that is local hospitals haven't seen wrestling-related injuries. The new WCW contracts call for a drop in pay if a wrestler is injured and unable to return after 30 days. The old contracts called for the drop in pay to be put into effect only after an injury that keeps a wrestler on the DL for 90 days. WWF. At this point, the only matches that seem definite for SummerSlam are Austin vs. Triple H for the title with Ventura as ref, Rock vs. Mr. Ass, and D'Lo Brown defending the IC title against Jarrett. Raw on July 26 at the Gund Arena in Cleveland drew a sellout 16,340, paying $404,159. Aaron O'Grady was brought in for a dark match with Kurt Angle before the Shotgun tapings. The show opened with Undertaker beating up X-Pac backstage. When Road Dogg came to help, Taker choke-slammed him. Undertaker was killing X-Pac some more until Kane came out, but that brought Big Show out to attack Kane. Fans chanted for Austin. No such luck. X-Pac was then taken out in an ambulance while Vince returned. Acolytes kept tag titles, beating Christian and Edge when Gangrel kidnapped Christian, and they did a double-team powerbomb to beat Edge in 340. Bob Holly did the ring intros and was pretty funny, and then announced himself as the winner. He got in the ring and attacked Farouk, but the Acolytes laid him out. Kane ran in and choke-slammed both Acolytes, Holly and Edge. Kane talked challenging Undertaker and Show. Steve Blackman then ran over Ken Shamrock with a car. Vince did a hilarious interview leading to Austin coming out. Vince wanted Austin to shake his hand, but Austin stunned him and called out Jim Ross to sing goodbye to Vince. Vince flipped everyone off at the end. Vince was totally preparing for a babyface turn. At the end, Howard Finkel was crying, and went up to Vince and told him he loved him, and Vince told him to get the hell out of here. In a street fight, Venus and Godfather beat Draws and Albert. Draws dressed like a guy this week, and the entire cross-dressing angle wasn't referred to. A plant in the stands, this time a fan, not shrubbery, who I believe was Vic Grimes, attacked Godfather. He was dressed in white, so he may have been a white pimp, and he may have been a religious zealot who hates good fun-loving pimps. Venus pinned Albert with the money shot in 301. Rock did another great interview. Triple H and Chyna did an interview challenging Rock to come out. He did, but Mr. Ass attacked him with a club and Chyna gave him a low blow. Billy Gunn does win the 1999 award for the wrestling trunks designed at a gay bar. Rock challenged Gunn and Chyna to a handicap match. Kane beat Show and Taker via DQ in 208 when Taker hit Kane twice with a chair. These were the kind of chair shota that would get people booed out of an ECW arena, but I was thankful they eased enough so nobody's brains got scrambled. Road Dogg did a run-in, but Show choke-slammed him. By this point I was trying to figure out what Road Dogg did to get put in this position and what Gunn did to get his position, since ever since they split, Road Dogg has gotten more over, and the more he gets over, the more he gets squashed. Jarrett and Deborah came out, with them teasing dissension again backstage. They brought actor Ben Stiller, who plugged his movie Mystery Men again. Stiller was kissing Jarrett's ass like he was Larry King hosting an interview and being so patronizingly annoying until Jarrett asked him who his favorite wrestler was, and he said he had two, the puppies. Jarrett beat him up and put him in the figure 4. Stiller gets the Best Sell Job award for a non-wrestler since the last time we saw Jason Sensation do an angle with Owen Hart. It was hilarious to watch him tapping out. The way I figure it, if you look at the question he was asked, that had to be the most retarded answer on so many levels to begin with, so I had no sympathy for him getting beaten up, and I loved Something About Mary. D'Lo Brown made the save, hit Jarrett with a frog splash and carried Stiller out. Ivory did an interview, basically ran down Nicole Base and challenged anyone in the house. I've got no clue what they see in her. Another plant came out who I didn't recognize, and Ivory KO'd her with the belt and was whipping on her until the other less marketable Tory made the save. Shamrock, fresh from being run over by a car and screaming like a wounded animal, I hope when he returns after a hiatus the Wizard of Oz can give his new ring character a brain, wrestled Triple H and got destroyed with the ref stopping it with Shamrock bleeding from the mouth at 3:57. Test beat up Pete Gas backstage. There was a sign waved all night that read, "Pete Gas is my hero. He's mine too, because he's proof that you can have no kind of a look, no kind of a physique, no charisma, no wrestling or acting ability, and nothing but have a childhood friend in high places, and you can still star on the most watched show on cable television." Finally, Rock, I presume, beat Mr. Ass in China. Triple H came out for commentary and interfered at one point. The match didn't have half the heat of the Nitro match going on at the same time, but still kicked ass in ratings. Triple H and Ross were arguing the entire match, and finally Triple H decked Ross, who also did a really good sell job. Austin showed up to save the stay and attacked Triple H, and they had a really good brawl outside the ring while Rock hit the rock bottom on Ass in China, and Austin and Triple H went through the announcer's table and the show went off the air just as Rock was about to give Mr. Ass a people's elbow. The ending was really hot again. Raw taping on July 27th in Columbus, Ohio, before another large sellout opened with Kurt Angle beating Rick Keys, local indie wrestler Chip Fairway, without doing his golfer gimmick, in a match that ended up with good pops for Angle's moves after starting cold. Jose Estrada Jr. DDQ El Marangaro when Papi Chulo and Miguel Perez both interfered. Savio Vega came out of the broadcast booth to separate the teams. Papi Chulo and Apollo Dantes beat Pantera and Sean Casey in a sloppy match with some good dives. For August 1st opened with Undertaker, Show, and Bearer. Undertaker challenged Austin to a title match on Raw, and said he's better than Kane because he has no compassion. Acolytes ended up challenging Undertaker and Show to a tag title match. With Vince gone, the CM is apparently disbanded. Edge beat Meat with the downward spiral. Meat acted exhausted again the entire match. Terry Runnels started yelling at him for losing. Jacqueline walked off while this was going on. Gangrel and Christian watched the match together. Prince Albert came out and said he couldn't wrestle due to doctor's orders. Chaz Warrington attacked him. The guy in the white suit, Grimes, destroyed Warrington with a flip leg drop off the top. Albert all this kissed Mariana. Blackman and Midian when Blackman used all sorts of weapons, and the ref pulled Midian out when Blackman pulled out some big blades. Acolytes beat Show and Undertaker via DQ in the tag title match when Undertaker laid both Acolytes out with a chair. Holly then attacked the Acolytes. Undertaker went after Holly, but Show stopped him. Jarrett and Deborah did an interview to build to a title versus title match with Brown for Raw. They also taped this, and the Heat banners were up, but it may have been for Shotgun. Hardy Boys over Papi Chulo and Sho Funaki when Jeff pinned Funaki in what was said to be the best match on the card, ending with a series of amazing dives, particular one by Chulo. Hayes was yelling at the Hardy Boys throughout and got mad when Jeff did the free bird strut. For Shotgun, Obbs beat Johnny Paradise. For Raw, the Acolytes opened challenging Undertaker and Show to a rematch. Holly came out and said the other two guys hadn't shown up yet, so he was challenging them to a handicap match. They killed with a series of power bombs. Edge beat Gangrel in a bloodbath match with a bucket of blood at ringside. Gangrel hit his DDT and went to get the blood. The lights went out, and when they came on, Gangrel was covered in blood, and Christian and Edge hugged, so they're back together again. They left together into the crowd. This was funny since one of them tripped as they left. So they went back and filmed them leaving together a second time. Shane McMahon did a long interview including ripping on WCW. Tess said he'd go through the posse to get to Shane. Brown won the IC belt from Jarrett. Deborah started to strip, but Brown didn't care. hit Jarrett with one of the belts and pinned him. This was said to be good. Undertaker and Show beat Road Dogg and Kane when Undertaker pinned Kane after a tombstone. The Acolytes came down after the match, but they were jumped by Holly, who hit both with a baseball bat. Mr. Ass did an interview saying he had film of Rock's ass coming out of the shower. They showed an ass coming out of a shower, but it certainly wasn't Rock's. Rock came back with an interview. Bossman kept the hardcore title, beating Viscera after putting him through a table. Test beat Rodney and was jumped by Obbs, but ended up injuring Rodney's arm. Blackman NC Venus when Shamrock showed up with a chain and chased Blackman all over the building. Main event was an Anything Goes title match with Austin vs. Undertaker. Triple H came out to stop the match, saying he was the one who deserves the next title match. Austin jumped him. Eventually half the world ended up out there, then everyone brawled to the back except Austin and Triple H, who brawled around the ringside area for several minutes, probably until the show went off the air. Austin most likely after the show went off hit Triple H and Big Show with stunners. There is a ton of talk that Triple H is getting the title, but the rule of thumb with guest refs, especially a governor, is that they catch the heel cheating, throw a punch at someone, and raise the face's hand at the end. Rena Mero will be on Stern on August 3rd. We keep forgetting to mention this, but it was reported in San Antonio media that Shawn Michaels was involved in a road rage incident where he allegedly pulled out a gun on a motorist who cut him off. The movie Hittin' the Mat, largely based around Mick Foley, Jake Roberts, and Terry Funk, is expected to be released in October. When the movie started filming, it was supposed to be something totally different, more of a look inside a business few knew about. Now with everyone knowing so much and basically being few secrets, it's more a look at the real lives of these three people. A few weeks back they were at Foley's house and he saw a film of his two kids watching the Royal Rumble finish, the 11 wicked chair shots to the head, and he'd never seen their reaction to it before and he was stunned. Some notes from the other off the record showed filmed on Thursday that will air after deadline. On the Vince and Linda show, they were saying how they weren't in the wrestling business, they were in the entertainment business, which is why, of course, they look for new talent from places like WCW and independent wrestling promotions rather than sign up all their new wrestlers from stints on Young and Restless. When asked if that was the case, why is the second width in the WWF name stand for wrestling, and Linda apparently said it was a strong brand name and they've given thoughts to changing it but are keeping it because the brand name was so strong. The Shane Stephanie interview was said to be every bit as much a puff piece as the first one wasn't. WWF is now acknowledging publicly that Shamrock is leaving to go back to UFC. Rena Mero is doing an ab roller commercial, noting that using the ab roller makes you look good when you're naked. The current porn magazine Gallery has a pre-lawsuit interview story with Mero calling her Sable. Now there's talk that the GTV camera person will be Terry Runnels. So if that is the case, we'd better forget that one feature ever took place where Terry Runnels was caught unsuspectingly by the GTV camera person. Jericho did a radio interview over the weekend and said he wouldn't be the one behind GTV and wouldn't be in DX, but didn't say he wouldn't be the Millennium Man, which he will be. He said WCW may be the place for him to be in a few years, but it isn't now. He said if he was running WCW, he'd book Benoit versus Hogan for the title next week and put Benoit over since Benoit is ready for the spot. He noted his WWF contract doesn't have as much money guaranteed as his offer from WCW, but the WWF deal is open-ended, so if he does well he'll earn more. He said he first started considering leaving when the booking committee canceled his program with Goldberg. He said when he got rid of Ralphus, he suggested to the booking committee to put him with some of the luchadores, feeling he'd done all he could with him, but Ralphus was over, so it would give the Mexicans a hook to elevate themselves. Draws missed most of this past week with a stinger. Mark Canterbury's contract won't be renewed. Savio Vega's contract also won't be, although he's still doing Spanish commentary and will work for Victor Quiñones Group in Puerto Rico when it gets going. Road Dogg signed a 5-year extension. The current plan, although this is not definite, is for Jesse Ventura to appear to do live angles at the Raw tapings on August 9th in Chicago and August 10th in Milwaukee. Ventura said he was doing the show on Sunday, which is his day off, although was criticized for being part of a press conference during working hours on a Wednesday, but wouldn't miss any work time for wrestling. He could keep his word and still do these shows, flying out of Minneapolis both nights after 5 p.m. and still making the tapings. Ventura was on Meet the Press on July 25th, and it wasn't one of his better appearances, particularly when wrestling was brought up. He got very defensive when the subject of the money came up. Tim Russert then read from an editorial in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which said Ventura had exposed himself as being a washed-up wrestler who sold the office of governor out for $1 million. Ventura responded by saying, "They don't know how much he's really getting, defending himself because the mayor of St. Paul is also working as a paid talk show host with a local radio station, although he's not hiding his income, and saying he wasn't a washed-up wrestler because Hogan is only 2 years younger than he is and Flair is older. Anyway, after all these years, it was a kick to hear that the name Ric Flair was being mentioned on Meet the Press. Deborah did a chat where she confirmed she's dating Austin. Tammy Sytch had claimed on the internet that she'd been talking to McMahon to help him in the lawsuit against Sable. Jim Ross on his web report came back saying that Sytch has never talked with McMahon recently or about that subject. The Owen Hart bio on A&E is scheduled to air in early December. The only house show of the week was the July 24th show at Skydome in Toronto before 15,220 paying $450,327. Between Toronto and the Raw in Cleveland, the merchandise was $188,458 in U.S. currency or $5.97 per head. Due to some sort of satellite problem, there was a problem with a lot of screens getting scrambled pictures for the fully loaded show in Southern California. Media Week had a story on July 26 about UPN, basically saying the SmackDown show is the key to the survival due to poor ratings. It said despite the criticism of airing WWF, UPN has convinced advertisers that wrestling will up the ratings on the network across the board, claiming the average viewer has 8 to 0 favorite channels they cruise, and the WWF will make UPN part of the 8 to 10 favorite channels with a huge audience. And exec VP on network sales Michael Mandelker said the advertisers have accepted this theory as valid and now they have to make sure the new shows draw ratings. On the Billboard Sports video charts for July 31st, the new Rock video was number 1 ahead of the new Austin video. WWF has 13 of the top 20, WCW has 4, and an 18th wrestling video is Wrestling with Shadows at number 16. Mick Foley during his time off has finished his autobiography, and while it's said to be out in December, he's looking at it being out in October and hoping to get Blood and Sweat Socks as the title of the book. Canadian weekly mag Maclean's had a back of the mag editorial highly critical of Raw. It brought up the same complaints seen everywhere: the Hart and Merrill lawsuits and the death of the child in Dallas. The readers' pages. Hall of Fame. I tend to be strict about Hall of Fame type things generally, but here are my votes: Keiji Muto, Fabulous Moolah, Wilbur Snyder. In Muto's case, I have a lot of respect for the Japanese style of wrestling, and he's one of the best. Moolah was obviously not a wrestler like many Japanese women, but she was girl wrestling in the United States for probably 20 years, plus she did start a lot of pretty decent American talent. Wilbur Snyder is easily ignored by history, but drew serious money and had great matches in the 50s and 60s. He was an excellent worker and a great athlete. Wild Bill Longson belongs. He held the world title several times when it meant something, was probably the first great heel champion, was a legitimate tough guy, a good worker, and drew money everywhere. He made the pile driver mean something. He's almost totally forgotten in wrestling history, but nonetheless he's a very special performer. Why not the following? Cactus Jack is very close because of his bump-taking and daredevil nature. He probably belongs soon. Undertaker I still think of as a Vince McMahon creation and not an entity of himself as a wrestling performer. Shawn Michaels is also close, but his dressing room antics both me and he was inconsistent in the ring, although he could be great plus. People like Kerry Von Erich, Dick Murdoch and Jimmy Snuka I really like. I truly cared for Murdoch as a friend. But the Hall of Fame should require a bit something extra. I often would equate Murdoch with Bill Miller from a few years earlier. I understand why many would put Snyder in that same category, but Snyder would have been world champion if the politics had been different. I probably wouldn't have voted for Robin Yount on the first ballot either. Regarding the Hall of Fame, Mexicans I recommend 1, Chavo Guerrero, but more for his international work. It's tough to read about him in Mexico because the bulk of his work was in border towns where press and stories are more anecdotal. Cien Caras is only a legend because of the dearth of EMLL heavyweights. Gran Hamada was a great worker but never a top draw. He should be in the Hall of Fame for technical wrestling brilliance for sure, though. Conan was a big star, but just for a short period of time, and he wasn't that good in the ring. Liz Mark was influential and won a lot of titles but never was the leading superstar that I see a Hall of Famer wrestler as. El Satanico I feel about the same as Dick Murdoch. He's the cutoff point. If wrestlers were better and more deserving than Satanico, they get in. Maybe in a few years if he's still important he'll get in. Japanese I recommend 5. Linus Asuka belongs in with Chigusa Nagio since they've been together throughout history. Masahiro Chono was the smartest worker in Japan of the 1990s. It's amazing what he's done while wrestling with so many injuries. Full Khan doesn't belong. Great in his style but not Hall of Fame caliber. Hiroshi Hazi is one of the best workers of this past decade but didn't have a long enough career, and didn't spend enough time on top. Shinya Hashimoto is a yes. Best world champion of the 90s in my opinion. Jushin Luger gets my highest recommendation of any candidate in any country. Bull Nakano is very close, but no. Masa Saito wasted his talent in the US and was rarely a big draw. Seiji Sakaguchi was very influential, but wasn't that great in the ring or at the gate. Tiger Jeet Singh wasn't good enough in the ring. Of the Americans, I don't recommend anyone. I feel Carlos Colon is very, very close. I feel Shawn Michaels was at one time the best worker in the whole world, and Sergeant Slaughter was at one time a great worker and huge draw are also very close. None of the other names is undeserving, but based on the caliber of entrants and so far and the criteria as I see them, I wouldn't vote for any others. My picks are Full Khan, Jushin Liger, Shawn Michaels, Shinya Hashimoto, Chavo Guerrero, Linus Asuka, Bull Nakano, Pedro Morales, Wahoo McDaniel and Jimmy Snuka. 6 of those picks are no-brainers. My problem is it's too soon. To be in the Hall of Fame, your career should be over or just about over. I voted for Morales because I saw him at the Olympic Auditorium when he was a great worker and he was a successful WWF champion. Look at how many failures there have been as WWF champions. I saw McDaniel when I lived in Texas and he was their Sammartino. I guess I shouldn't vote for Snuka since he killed his girlfriend, but he was a star everywhere he went. With his history of abusing women, he'd fit in great with today's wrestling. This system, however, means nobody from before 1980 is going to get in. Who will vote for Frank Sexton or Shandor Sabo when Cactus Jack is on the list? How many of your readers even know who Lid Exhibishko is? There's too many people in already. Names withheld for political and confidentiality reasons. Ogawa Takada. The participation of Naoya Ogawa in Pride was a positive factor as a drawing card as well as a negative element for pure martial arts. But his participation made the show profitable because of the pro wrestling aspects of the show. It was a ceremonial passing of the torch of the shooter rep from Nobuhiko Okada to Ogawa, and they succeeded in making a star for the next century in the former world judo champion. The performance not only satisfied the public who saw Ogawa versus Gary Goodridge treated as serious on the TV sports news, but also attained a business purpose. We've seen suspicious fights from UFC to sumo. There are matches where the promoter as well as both fighters truly know who is going over at the end even if they aren't setting up high spots and finishes. Shoot and work have been unified since they've been presented to the public from the birth of mankind. There are stone murals in ancient times as the proof of the ancestry of worked pro wrestling since they feature drawing of too many moves and counterholds and suplexes that require both cooperation and coordination of both men. There is a Greek sculpture depicting the powerbomb as we know it. The Colosseum in Rome is a tourist spot, famous for the legend of fight until death rules battles, but in reality it's natural to assume their super fights in front of huge crowds also involved entertainment aspects. The truth is of course boring to learn, because the truth can't match up to fans' fantasy and imagination. Martial arts competition before the king or the rich sponsor in ancient times can be found in building up super fights and main events. It's all the same story today, except today the king are the fans spending money on t-shirts, tickets, pay-per-view orders and videotapes. The original UWF movement to turn the fantasy of pro wrestling into reality was accomplished this year. The 10-plus year history of the UWF movement is meaningless to talk about which cards and matches were worked and which weren't. Akira Maeda's rings, which spawned K1 along with Pride as derivatives, have epic-making meanings in the history of real fighting. We've seen the truth and it will be carried on to the next millennium. Takada did 3 jobs at Pride and they were all real fights. Hickson Gracie is a legend from a different world. It was just a different world, nothing more and nothing less. Takada fought Gracie under Gracie's Vale Tudo rules and lost twice. Akira Maeda never had a real match in his fighting life. Masakatsu Funaki had many real matches, maybe too many. Takada was just the man in the middle between the two. The man in the middle position is always tough, but he headlined Tokyo Dome mega shows against Hickson. They are like 3 brothers. The older brother couldn't do it himself. The youngest brother sacrificed his body for the cause. But the pain put on the middle brother was beyond the imagination. Takada became the first superstar pro wrestler to step into the real world. It's all part of the theory of time lag. The general public's permeation and understand of what this is requires years of education. The UWFI fighters in the 90s were all real shooters from the top to the bottom, including Kazushi Sakuraba and Kiyoshi Tamura. Sports entertainment pro wrestling, born in the United States, was transformed into Japan, the country of the original martial arts, including the myths and the sophisticated art form. When Takada and Gracie signed for the fight of the century, the truth is that both were already washed up by that point, and that's the sad truth. But the truth is boring. Takada was requested to pass the torch directly to Ogawa, but he refused, as he should have. Takada has no reason to lose to a pro wrestler in the Pride ring, and Ogawa is a pro wrestler. Instead, he lost to Mark Kerr, the realistic top fighter in the world, as opposed to a mythical legend such as Hickson. Kerr recorded an impressive 14 straight wins in mixed martial arts. He is the current monster. Takada lost to the real champion, so we should praise him for that. Takada versus Kerr was not a fixed fight. He was challenging a much larger white monster without compromise. I didn't see any holes, and Kerr told his friends it was real afterwards. However, it was an example of a match that the promoter, booker, and both fighters knew ahead of time who was going over. Kerr accepted this fight because it was Takada, and not Enson Inoue, who may have had more than a 50% chance of winning. That's the reality of the fighting business. Takada is still a pro wrestler who is a product of image making. The Naked King understood his role in this one. He came into the ring with tape around his elbow. Kerr's last submission finish was the arm lock against Pedro Otavio. We realized the message at that point. It was like seppuku ritual, an honorable death in the samurai world. But pro wrestling proved to be a real martial art, and Takada proved it by committing suicide. He drove a wedge in the fixed label of wrestling by carrying the cross. For wrestling fans, sins the sin of believing that pro wrestling was real. On November 29, 1989 at Ucosmos at the Tokyo Dome show, which featured Maeda and Takada, we saw a miracle on the undercard with Yoji Anjo's shoot match and Minoru Suzuki versus Maurice Smith. It was the moment pro wrestling stepped into the line of reality combat. It was awesome. With Satoru Sayama, the first Tiger Mask, who opened the world's very first Total Fight gym in 1984. It was irony that he claimed his new sport of shooting as competition and not as pro wrestling. Shudo, which came from that, celebrated its 10th anniversary on May 29, headlining Rumina Sato vs. Kaoru Uno. It was their first pay-per-view match, and they sold out the Yokohama Bunka Gym specifically on the main event theme of Can Rising Prince Uno beat his ex-teacher? To me, it was really pro wrestling, although the fight itself was real. For real sports journalism, the highlight of Pride is Sakuraba's winning streak. On July 4th, the Carlson Gracie Jiu-Jitsu army were all defeated. The heavyweight Carlos Barreto couldn't beat the smaller Ukraine kickboxer Igor Vachenchin. The top fighter from the Ludolever camp, Ebenezer Fontes Braga, was tapped out by a UWF pro wrestler with an armbar. It was officially the end of the illusion of Brazilians as being the strongest fighters, that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was not the perfect fighting system, and that a pro wrestler proved to be the strongest martial artist of all. But the sad truth about real fighting was in the undercard. On the Pride show, there were 4 boring matches that went for 25 minutes each. A former king of Pancrase wasn't able to win a split decision, while a Battle Arts pro wrestler got a decision over a well-known jiu-jitsu expert who beat Renzo Gracie earlier this year, Tadashi Tanaka. New York, New York. Ventura. Your observations of Governor Jesse Ventura's decision to participate in SummerSlam were right on the money. However, hopping upon hope that he's got something much bigger up his sleeve, and that is that he'll string Vince McMahon along through all the hype and involvement leading right up to the show before pulling out at the last minute. The ultimate screw job. In one fell swoop, Ventura will pay back McMahon, costing him unheard of dollars and face. He'd be able to contend that this was his master plan all along, teaching big, bad nasty McMahon a lesson he'll never forget on behalf of the American public, the Hart family, and God only knows whom else. In doing so, he'd add to his reputation as a renegade establishment-busting hero while repairing any political damage he may have already done to himself. At least that's what I'm hoping for. Jeff Siegel. Evanston, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. Don't hold your breath waiting for that one. WCW. I just finished watching Raw and Nitro and I don't get it. When Ric Flair and angle that he did 15 years ago, he's reliving a classic moment in wrestling. We don't get enough of that. Instead, we get a mysterious Sting. Again. What's the point? Didn't we just see that angle? What does Sting have to prove to Nash anyway? First, he shouldn't be buddies with Nash because he was part of the evil NWO. Then, when the NWO split and became the Wolfpack, Sting teamed with Nash, was injured, forgotten, and disappeared. Now they tease he drove the Hummer. But really, he didn't, because we all know Sting is the franchise. But the announcers don't know, and we as wrestling fans are supposed to not be able to tell the difference between the wrestler formerly known as Cobra and the real Sting. What the hell does Bischoff think he's doing? He could start a third promotion with the guys he's not using, and it would be a better promotion than the one he has. At this point, Sergeant Slaughter's AWF Warriors of Wrestling was more entertaining than WCW. What I want to watch is three-time karate champion fight the ever-dangerous Jerry Flynn in a kickboxing match. The only thing worse would be seeing Roddy Piper fight Marcus Alexander Bagwell in a boxing match. Am I the only person now longing for the days of the ding-dongs and the gobbledygooker? Okay, maybe that's being harsh, but if internet stories are true, and the net is almost never wrong. But if Bischoff really thinks Kevin Nash is the only person that can book for him, then something is wrong in this world. I suppose nobody else could do the job Nash has done. Wrestling fans everywhere should thank God for that. Bret Hart? Does anybody care? Sorry, but if he can't make a decision, don't get up in front of a half-full Georgia Dome and bore people to the point that some guy in the crowd is audibly yelling "shut up." Do you think WCW could have sold a few more tickets if they had announced the main event ahead of time and pushed the return of Goldberg? Most people didn't even know Goldberg was on the show because they were too busy watching the cage match or flipping to Ricky Martin's top 10 videos on MTV. Megadeth in the final quarter hour. The only thing that's surprising about Chris Jericho's jump is that when the Vanilla Midgets had the chance to bail, they chose the money and believed Bischoff. Malenko and Benoit may be the only things worthwhile in WCW today, but that's only because Mysterio Jr. unmasked and the rest of the luchadores are unmasking for Eddie Guerrero in a skit that went nowhere. So who stole his wallet anyway? Or did that angle just end without an ending as always? It's a sad state of affairs when Rap is Crap gets the same amount of TV airtime as the world title match. Rick Jones. Salt Lake City, Utah. Response from Dave Meltzer. It's actually not all that sad that Rap is Crap got the same amount of airtime as that specific world title match. Regarding Malenko and Benoit leaving, people are fooling themselves if they think Malenko made the wrong decision in staying. Benoit at this point looks like he did, but Malenko would have been buried underground had he gone to the WWF. I've been watching this sport for about 45 years. The first match I remember seeing starred Gorgeous George, who wasn't Randy Paffo's girlfriend. Personally, I enjoy seeing the older wrestlers perform as I've seen most of them from the start of their career. However, having said that, I don't think WCW should be marketing their product toward me. I'm not going to be buying any of the stuff they advertise. They need to market toward my kids, who are in their 20s and 30s. I appreciate their efforts to entertain me. I'm probably one of the few people around who like to watch the old-timers perform. I used to watch Randy Savage's father Angelo when he formed a tag team with Bronco Lubick. I remember seeing Greg Valentine as a rookie wrestling under the name Babyface Nelson, and I certainly remember Johnny Valentine. If they want to push the old folks, it won't disappoint me, but it can't be good for business. On another note, whose idea was it to push Kevin Nash? He is one of the most uncharismatic headline wrestlers of all time. He can't work. He can't talk. He can't get heat. He's being pushed like he's the reincarnation of Bill Goldberg. Does anyone buy his toys, videos and his other junk? How does the Goldberg pay-per-view sell as compared to the Page pay-per-view? Where is Nash's stuff as far as merchandise sales go? Even Sid Eudy, who also can't work, has far more charisma and at least has the potential to get over with a crowd. Does anyone in the office has a clue about what is going on with their product? Dick Fagerlund. Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities.